She was supposed to be invisible, just a waitress. But when Nora Calloway heard the words "no witnesses" whispered outside a VIP room in Chicago's most exclusive restaurant, whispered in the voice of a woman who wore a $40,000 engagement ring and smiled like she meant it, everything changed. Because Nora knew what those words cost. She'd watched them cost her father 8 years of his life, and she wasn't going to let them cost another man his. Stay until the end to see how one act of courage unravels a billion-dollar conspiracy. Drop a like and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The champagne was Billionaire Salmon Vintage 2014. The oysters were Boulogne. And the lies Nora Calloway was learning were flawless. She moved through the private dining room of Alara with the practiced economy of someone who had long ago made peace with invisibility. 14 years since she'd stepped inside a room like this. Not as staff, but as a guest. A girl in a borrowed dress beside her father at his company's annual gala. And in the intervening years, she had learned that the distance between the two sides of a silver tray was not measured in inches, but in the kind of ruthless compounding luck that some people called circumstance and others called life. Nora preferred to call it what it was, the difference between the people who owned the world and the people who served it. Alara occupied the 42nd floor of the Harrington Tower on Michigan Avenue, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing a panorama of Lake Michigan that turned the city into something almost mythological at night, a glittering sprawl of ambition pressed up against an inland sea. The dining room itself was intimate by design, 12 tables maximum, each separated by hand-blown glass partitions that gave the illusion of privacy while ensuring that everyone could see and be seen. The lighting was tuned to a warmth that made everyone look 20 years younger and 20 pounds lighter. The menu changed weekly and had no prices printed on it. Membership cost more than most mortgages. Nora had worked the floor for 19 months. She knew every regular by name, every preference by heart. Mr. Castillo in Table 4 liked his steak rested 4 minutes longer than the kitchen recommended and never said thank you. The Whitmore sisters, who reserved Table 7 every Thursday, shared a single entree and drank 3 bottles of Sancerre between them. Senator Keene always requested the corner booth near the service door, which Nora had privately concluded was either because he was claustrophobic or because he liked to watch who came and went. Probably both. She balanced the silver tray against her hip and worked the room, her feet logging what she estimated was her 8,000th hour in restaurant. Grade non-slip shoes that had long since stopped being comfortable, her lower back maintaining its quiet protest, her smile fixed in the particular configuration she had developed over years. Warm enough to be genuine, distant enough to be professional, and entirely impenetrable. "Excuse me." She ghosted past a woman in Valentino. "Thank you." She set a glass of aged Madeira at a corner table without disturbing the conversation. "My apologies." She caught a toppling flute before it could shatter the near disaster invisible to everyone at the table. She was good at this. She had always been good at this, the art of being exactly where she was needed without being anywhere at all. She caught her reflection in the polished steel of a service trolley as she passed dark hair swept into a low chignon white uniform, the kind of face that strangers described as serious when they meant something less generous. 30 years old. Dark circles that concealed beneath her cheekbones no matter how many hours she slept, which lately was not many. A small scar above her left eyebrow from a fall she'd taken at 17, running late to her father's trial. She never had made it in time that day. She pushed the thought away. She always pushed it away. Nora. Marco, the floor manager, appeared at her elbow with the suppressed urgency he deployed for situations ranging from a spilled wine to an actual cardiac emergency, his voice calibrated at the same pitch regardless. "VIP suite. They need a second decan of the '09 Screaming Eagle." He paused for emphasis. "Elliot Mace's table." Nora's expression didn't change. Inside, something tightened. She knew the name. Everyone in Chicago knew the name. Elliot Mace, founder and CEO of Mace Dynamics, the defense and AI software company that had spent the last 6 years quietly revolutionizing the architecture of national security infrastructure. 36 years old? Net worth estimated at somewhere north of $14 billion, depending on the quarter. Born in Pilsen, the son of a machinist and a school librarian, which the financial press mentioned in every profile as though it were a character reference rather than a biographical fact. He'd built his company from a two-room office in Wicker Park to a contractor responsible for securing the communication systems of three branches of the armed forces. Tonight was his engagement party. Nora retrieved the decant from the cellar vault, a bottle she would never in her life afford to open, and made her way toward the VIP suite at the north end of the floor. The suite was accessed through a frosted glass corridor, guarded by two men in dark suits whose earpieces and flat professionally bored expressions identified them as private security of the serious variety. One of them nodded her through without comment. The suite was smaller than the main dining room and far more intimate. A single oval table beneath a chandelier of hand-blown Murano glass, 8 chairs, 4 of them occupied. The windows here faced north, and the view of the lake at night was nothing short of staggering black water catching the lights of Navy Pier like a scatter of fallen stars. Nora moved to the credenza and began the careful business of a second decant, her back 3/4 to the table, her awareness, as always, total. She catalogued the table in her peripheral vision. Elliot Mace sat at the head. Taller than she'd expected from magazine photographs, 6'2" at minimum, with the broad-shouldered build of someone who still worked with his hands for reasons beyond vanity, though the charcoal suit on his frame had been cut by someone who charged by the syllable. His face was harder in person, a jaw that looked like it had been used, dark eyes that moved constantly and rested on nothing for more than a second, the particular stillness of someone who was always thinking. He was laughing at something one of his guests had said, and the laugh was genuine. It reached his eyes and changed his entire face, making him look briefly like the boy from Pilsen instead of the CEO from Forbes. To his left, Claudia Wren, his fiancée. Nora had seen Claudia Wren's face on enough society pages to have formed a prior opinion, and the woman in person either confirmed or transcended it, she couldn't decide which. Claudia was extraordinary in the particular way of women who had spent significant resources becoming so platinum hair swept into an architecture of casual elegance bone structure that made the light work for her regardless of angle, a champagne Schiaparelli gown that had probably been made for her specifically. The engagement ring on her left hand was a cushion-cut diamond of at least 4 carats that caught the chandelier and threw it back in fractured rainbows. She was laughing too, her hand resting on Elliot's forearm, her eyes moving around the table with the practiced animation of a woman who had mastered the performance of joy. Performing was the word that lodged itself in Nora's mind. She couldn't have explained why. Perfect timing. Elliot Mace's voice was low resonant, the kind of voice that carried without being raised. He gestured toward the decant. We were about to start the main course. Of course. Nora positioned the decanter, began the careful pour. To the man who somehow convinced the most remarkable woman I've ever met to say yes, said the man across from Elliot. Silver-haired patrician, the easy authority of someone who had been powerful for so long he'd forgotten it wasn't natural. To Claudia, Elliot said, raising his glass. His voice held something that Nora recognized from a great distance as the specific warmth of a man who still couldn't quite believe his luck. She'd heard it once before, years ago, in her father's voice when he talked about her mother. The glasses clinked. Claudia smiled. Nora poured the last glass and stepped back. She was almost to the door when she noticed Claudia's hand. It was resting on the table, ostensibly relaxed. But beneath the stone-perfect composure, the fingers were trembling. The smallest tremor barely visible, the kind of involuntary signal that the body sends when the mind is under a stress it cannot fully suppress. In 2 years of caring for her ailing grandmother before that money ran out too, Nora had learned to read those signals. Pain, fear, guilt. The body kept its own account. She studied Claudia's face for a fraction of a second. The smile was still there, brilliant, unwavering. But her eyes kept finding the exits. Will there be anything else? Elliot glanced up. For just a moment, his attention landed fully on her, not the dismissive flicker of most guests, but the actual present attention of someone who was used to reading rooms. No, thank you. A pause. You've been excellent tonight. He reached into his jacket pocket, produced a folded bill, held it toward her with the casual generosity of someone for whom the gesture was automatic. Nora accepted it without looking at the denomination. Enjoy your evening, Mr. Mace. She turned. She was in the glass corridor, 6 steps from the service door, when she heard the voices. They were coming from the alcove to her left, a maintenance nook tucked beside the utility elevator, barely large enough for 2 people to stand in. The door was ajar, a sliver of light falling across the corridor floor. Nora's footsteps were silent on the carpet. She wasn't trying to listen, but the words stopped her cold. Authentication codes are on his personal device. The voice was male, quiet, clipped with the precision of someone who chose each word before releasing it. We move at 11:30. Confirm the transfer is initiated before anyone realizes the system's been breached. A pause. Then a second voice. Softer. Female. Claudia's voice. I'll keep him at the table. The toast, the dessert course, he won't check his phone until midnight at the earliest. A pause. Just make sure Ashby's people are in position before the lights go. I don't want any variables. And the staff? Claudia's answer came without hesitation, smooth and perfectly calibrated, and it was the smoothness of it that made it worse. Collateral. We minimize exposure where we can, but the timeline is fixed. No witnesses. Nora stopped breathing. The service door was 4 steps away. She was standing motionless in the corridor, her back to the wall, the decant tray still in her hands. If she moved, the carpet would muffle her steps, but the door's hinges were loud, she knew, because she'd filed a maintenance request about them 3 weeks ago that had gone unanswered. She held still. The foundry. Claudia again. Ready. Ashby confirmed this morning. The server arrays went live at 6 p.m. Once the authentication codes transfer, the routing is automatic, 7 layers, 15 jurisdictions, 40 million in the first wave. The male voice. By the time anyone traces it, it's all ready. I don't need the technical briefing. Claudia's tone sharpened. I just need confirmation that nothing can be traced to me. Nothing will be. Silence. The sound of footsteps within the alcove moving toward the door. Nora moved. Not running. Running would be louder, but walking with the precise, controlled speed of someone who knew exactly where every creaking floorboard was. 4 steps. She hit the service door and pushed through into the corridor beyond, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her jaw. She made it 12 feet before her knees started shaking. She pressed herself against the wall behind a rack of linen trolleys, her breathing controlled through sheer force of will, and stared at the ceiling and thought about what she'd just heard. Authentication codes. 11:30? No witnesses. The foundry. She needed to think. She needed to be rational. She was a banquet server with 19 months of experience and a pending electric bill, and a sister who called twice a week from Evanston, and a life that fit in a 500-square-foot apartment on the north side. She was not the kind of person who intervened in whatever this was. She thought about her father. His name was Edward Calloway, 61 years old. Currently residing in the Sheridan Correctional Center in Kankakee, where he had been for 8 years following his conviction on 17 counts of securities fraud and embezzlement crimes that he had not committed, that Nora had spent every resource she possessed trying to prove. He had not committed, that had nevertheless consumed his career, his freedom, and most of the remaining years of his life. The name that had appeared repeatedly in the financial reconstruction of her father's case, always just out of reach, always behind one more layer of corporate structure, Victor Ashby, CEO of Ashby Group. Make sure Ashby's people are in position. Nora's hands stopped shaking. She looked down at the small notepad she kept in her apron pocket for table orders. She looked at the pen clipped to its cover. She thought about what she needed to say and how to say it in the 5 seconds she would have. She thought, if I do this, I can't undo it. She thought, if I don't, someone dies tonight. She pulled out the notepad. Bam. She had 6 minutes. The VIP suite was louder when she returned. The main course had arrived, conversation at full pitch. Elliot mid-story, with the animated energy of a man who was, for the first time in a long evening, genuinely relaxed. Claudia sat beside him, her performance flawless, her trembling hand now hidden in her lap. Nora approached with the water pitcher. Refills the universal cover for proximity. She moved clockwise around the table, pouring invisible, and as she reached Elliot's position, she angled her body slightly, the kind of subtle misstep that could be blamed on the narrow space between chair and table, and let the pitcher tilt. Not enough to spill. Barely a drop caught the edge of his sleeve. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Mace." She reached across with the folded service cloth in her right hand, dabbing at the fabric, and in the motion practiced in the service corridor 6 minutes ago against a linen cart. 5 attempts until she could do it without looking. She pressed the small square of notepad paper between the cloth and his wrist. His fingers closed on it without looking down. Not at all. His voice was easy, unbothered. No harm done. Nora straightened, murmured another apology to the table, and retreated with the professional efficiency of someone whose only crime was a momentary clumsiness. Behind her, she heard Claudia's voice, a shade too sharp. Was that necessary? She bumped the chair, Elliot's tone undisturbed. Drop it. Nora pushed through the suite door, walked 16 feet down the corridor, turned into the linen alcove, and sat down on an overturned bus tub with her back against the wall and closed her eyes. The note had read, Claudia is the threat. 11:30. Leave now. She'd added a secondary line, the one she hadn't been sure about until the pen was already moving Ashby. The Foundry. They know your phone. 6 words that would either save a life or end hers. The clock on her phone read 11:04 p.m., 26 minutes. She was sitting in the staff locker room pulling on her coat when the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a brownout. A clean total severance, every fixture on the floor extinguished simultaneously the ambient hum of the HVAC system, cutting off a half-second later, and then the city glow coming faintly through the high windows, and then nothing but the blue ghost light of her phone screen. For 2 seconds, the floor was completely silent. Then the screaming started. Nora was on her feet before she'd made a conscious decision to move. The locker room door opened onto the staff corridor that ran parallel to the main dining floor, and as she pushed into it, she could already hear the percussion of chaos from beyond the partition wall. Chairs scraping glass, breaking the high-frequency panic sound of 60 people suddenly deprived of light and the illusion of safety. Fire, she thought first. But there was no smell of smoke, no alarm, no sprinkler system thundering to life. Then she heard the doors, the sound of heavy boots on marble, multiple pairs, coordinated, moving fast. She pressed herself flat against the corridor wall as the main dining room erupted, shouting, now not panic, but command male voices cutting through the noise with the authority of men who had rehearsed this. She heard a burst of gunfire, a ceiling shot from the acoustics, and the screaming doubled in volume and then stopped, replaced by the terrible compliant silence of people who understood they were outgunned. Get down! Everybody down! Nobody moves! Nora's mind moved rapidly through the geometry of the floor. The VIP suite was at the north end. The gunmen had entered through the main east entrance. The service door on the west wall led to the utility elevator and the corridor where she'd overheard Claudia. If Elliot had read the note, if he'd had the presence of mind to act on it before the lights went, there was one path out that the tactical team might not have covered yet. She moved without letting herself think about what she was doing. Down the service corridor, past the wine vault, past the cold storage, through the stainless steel door of the main kitchen, which was chaos of a different kind. Chefs crouched behind prep stations, a sous chef pressed into the walk-in cooler pots still steaming on abandoned burners. She cut through the kitchen toward the north end of the building, toward the service entrance that connected to the VIP suite's private passage. She was halfway across the kitchen floor when a hand caught her arm. She spun, raised the water pitcher she was still somehow holding, and stopped. The man who'd grabbed her was in his mid-40s, gray at the temples, built like someone who had spent decades in environments where being large was an asset. He wore a dark tactical jacket over a dress shirt incongruous, like he'd had to change his plans in a hurry, and an earpiece, and his eyes were the flat, professionally calibrated eyes of someone who assessed threats for a living. Nora Calloway. Not a question. She went still. Who are you? Sable Cross, head of Mr. Mace's security. A beat. You gave him the note? Yes. Good. Sable's hand released her arm. He's already out of the suite. We pulled him through the service exit at the north end the moment he read it. We need to move. Right now. Where? Kitchen exit. South alley. We have a vehicle. Sable was already moving, and Nora followed because the alternative was standing in a dark kitchen, waiting for armed men to find her. They came out of the kitchen service exit into the stainless steel back of house through a utility corridor that smelled of old grease and industrial cleaner, and threw a heavy fire door into the alley behind the tower. Cold air hit her face like a strike. November in Chicago, and the wind off the lake was merciless. The alley was narrow and dark, flanked by dumpsters, and the compressed infrastructure of a 42-story commercial building, power conduits, gas lines, recycling compactors. A black SUV idled at the alley's south end engine, running lights off, and standing between the fire door and the SUV jacket. Gonsalves rolled his face, set in an expression Nora had not seen in the dining room. Focused, controlled, and very, very cold was Elliot Mace. He looked at her when she emerged, a direct assessing look that lasted perhaps 2 seconds and contained more active intelligence than most people deployed in a full conversation. "You're the one who warned me." "Yes?" "What did you hear exactly?" Nora told him, quickly, cleanly, in the precise language of someone who had trained herself to compress information under stress. The male voice, Claudia's response. The authentication codes. 11:30. Ashby's people. The foundry. No witnesses. Elliot listened without moving. His jaw tightened once at Claudia's name and then was still. "How long have you worked the floor here?" 19 months. "And you've never seen anything unusual before tonight?" "I've seen things I didn't understand. Tonight was the first time I understood." Something shifted in his expression, not quite surprise, more like the recalibration of a prior assumption. He started to speak. The fire door exploded open behind them. 3 men in tactical gear poured into the alley, the same black-clad balaclava mask configuration she'd heard on the dining floor, weapons up, moving with the smooth, terrible efficiency of trained violence. Sable was already turning her own weapon, clearing its holster in a single fluid motion. "Vehicle now." Elliot moved without hesitating, his hand closing around Nora's wrist, pulling her toward the SUV. She ran. There was nothing else to do. Her restaurant flat skidding on the wet November pavement, and behind her she heard Sable's weapon fire the detonating crack of it in the enclosed alley, and then return fire. And then Elliot was shoving her into the SUV's rear door, and she hit the seat hard, and he was in behind her door, slamming. The driver was already accelerating. Female 20s, short hair, the exact expression of total focus. Not fear, just the hyper-attentive blankness of someone for whom speed and precision had become a native language. The SUV rocketed forward, tires screaming on the alley asphalt, clipping a dumpster with a sound like a gunshot. Behind them, through the rear window, Nora saw muzzle flash. She heard the crack of rounds impacting metal. Then they were out of the alley, launching onto a side street, the driver executing a sweeping left turn that pressed Nora hard into the door, and the alley was gone, and the restaurant was gone, and the 42nd floor, and the Murano chandelier, and the champagne, and the fiction of Claudia Wren's smile were all receding in the wake of the speeding vehicle. Nora pressed both hands flat on her thighs and focused on breathing. "Status," Elliot said to the driver. "Sable's still in the alley. She called it clean, 2 hostiles down 1 mobile. She's routing to secondary extraction." The driver's voice was steady. "We have a tail, 1 vehicle, maintaining distance." Elliot turned to the rear window, assessed, turned back. He looked at Nora. "Are you hit?" "No." She checked herself with a quick inventory, hands, arms, torso. "No." "Good." He was on his phone now, typing. "We're going off grid. I have a property north of the city, Barrington Hills. Private road, no digital footprint." "What about Sable?" "She'll meet us there. She's done this before." A ghost of something crossed his face. "We've all done this before." Nora stared at him. "This has happened before." "Not like this." His voice was tight. "Not with someone I trusted." He paused on the last word, and in the silence that followed it, Nora heard the thing beneath it. Not anger, not yet something rawer. Confusion. The particular wound of a betrayal that the mind hasn't yet accepted as real. "Claudia has been with me for 2 years." "I know." "She was going to be—" He stopped, exhaled, restarted. "Tell me about the foundry. You said they mentioned a foundry." "The man she was talking to said the foundry is ready, that Ashby's server arrays went live at 6 p.m. tonight." Nora watched his face. "You know what it is? Victor Ashby." Elliot said the name with a flatness that told her it wasn't a surprise, not the name anyway, just the scale of it. CEO of Ashby Group. He's been after the DoD contract my company just won. We're talking about a 15-year deal worth $68 billion. Ashby's been trying to break me for 3 years, regulation challenges, litigation poaching my people. He paused. I knew it was escalating. I didn't know how far. The man on the phone said 40 million in the first wave. Nora's voice was careful. He said the routing was through 15 jurisdictions. He mentioned pension accounts. Elliot went very still. What? She watched his expression change. The Mace Foundation runs a deferred compensation program for defense sector workers, he said slowly. About 14,000 beneficiaries. The accounts are held in a custodial structure that routes through our main financial platform. He looked at her. If Ashby has the authentication codes, he doesn't just get access to my personal accounts. He gets the whole system. 14,000 and their families. His voice was controlled, but barely. He's not stealing from me. He's stealing from retired machinists and logistics coordinators and clerical staff who spent 30 years. He stopped. His jaw worked. Nora thought about her father, about the men in his unit at Calloway Financial who had lost their severance when the company collapsed, about the way ordinary people became collateral in wars they didn't know were being fought. We have to stop the transfer, she said. Yes. Elliot was already dialing. And then we have to find the foundry. He looked at her again, that full direct attention. You said you've lived in this city your whole life. Born and raised. How well do you know the South Lakefront, the industrial corridor, Calumet, the old steel district? Nora's heart slowed by approximately 1 beat. The South Lakefront, the Calumet River industrial corridor, the old Ashby steel plant that had been decommissioned in 2009 and purchased for redevelopment that never happened. The plant where her father had consulted on 3 separate remediation contracts in the mid-90s. The plant whose loading dock tunnels she had once explored at age 12, following him through the underground infrastructure while he narrated the engineering in terms she didn't yet understand, but filed away entirely. She understood them now. I know it, she said. Better than I should. Something changed in Elliot Mace's expression. Not relief, something more complicated. The specific look of a man recalculating the odds in real time. Then we need to talk, he said. The SUV banked north onto Lakeshore Drive, the lake on their right, now vast and black and uncaring. Behind them, the tail had dropped back. Either they'd lost it or it was hanging off, biding its time. The driver said nothing. Elliot made 3 more calls in quick succession, his voice clipped and precise, and with each call, Nora felt the shape of what was coming solidify around her. She was no longer just a witness. She was a participant. She'd known that the moment she pressed the note into his hand. Some part of her had known it even earlier, standing in the corridor outside that alcove, listening to Claudia Wren discuss the disposal of human inconveniences with the serenity of someone ordering a dinner course. Some part of her had recognized in that moment that the invisible thing she had been trying to do for 8 years, stay below the surface, stay safe, stay away from anything that might explode, was finished. Victor Ashby's name was in this. She was certain of it now. She looked out the window at the city moving past, at the lights of Lakeshore Drive, at the black expanse of the water beyond, and she let herself admit what she had been pushing down since the moment she pressed her back against that corridor wall. She wasn't just here to save a stranger. She was here to save her father. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. A single text message, no sender information, no context. Just 9 words that turned the warmth in the SUV to something close to ice. We know what you did. We have your sister. Nora's hand tightened on the phone until the screen cracked at the corner. Elliot. Her voice was flat, controlled. The voice she'd used at her father's sentencing when she refused to cry in public. We need to move faster. He looked at her, at the phone, at her face. Tell me, he said. She showed him the screen. In the silence that followed, the SUV drove north through the Chicago night, carrying 2 people who had just in different ways run out of the option to be careful. The safe house in Barrington Hills was 52 miles north of the city and existed on no digital registry that Nora could have found. It sat at the end of a private gravel road behind a gate marked with the logo of a landscape architecture firm that she suspected had never landscaped anything. The building was designed to look like a large residential property, wraparound porch, low-slope roof, the kind of carefully maintained neutrality that said nothing to a passing eye. Inside it was something else entirely. She counted 4 separate workstations before she stopped counting. Monitors running security feeds from a dozen angles, a satellite uplink the size of a suitcase, a weapons cache behind a reinforced door that Sable Cross opened with a code and a biometric palm scan without breaking stride, steel-reinforced window frames, a server rack in the basement that hummed with the quiet diligence of serious computational work. "How long have you had this?" Nora asked. 3 years, Elliot said. "After the second time someone tried to steal my R&D, I decided that reacting was a losing strategy." He moved to the main workstation and pulled up a dashboard, his fingers fluid, on the keyboard. "Felix, status." The voice that responded came from a laptop in the corner where a young man sat, late 20s, wiry, the kind of physical intensity that expressed itself entirely in stillness, like a held breath. Felix Oren. He had already been at the workstation when they arrived, which told Nora that Elliot's phone calls in the SUV had accomplished more than she'd understood at the time. "Authentication servers are being probed from 3 offshore IPs," Felix said without looking up. "They're systematic, hitting the 2-factor layer with a pattern that suggests they have partial credentials already. Best guess Claudia gave them your reset protocols, and they're building from there." Elliot's jaw tightened. "How long until they break through? The security architecture is solid, but if they have the secondary encryption keys, which if Claudia had access to your device management portal, they probably do, then somewhere between 90 minutes and 3 hours. Felix finally looked up. His eyes were very dark, very direct. "We need to either lock the accounts completely or cut the authentication thread at the server level. Locking the accounts triggers a regulatory hold. It'll take the pension fund administrators 4 to 6 days to lift it and restore access." Elliot's voice was steady. "That's 14,000 people without access to their deferred compensation accounts. And if we don't lock them, Ashby drains them." Felix spread his hands in the gesture of a man presenting an impossible menu. "Those are your options on the defensive side. Unless we can physically stop the transfer at the source, meaning at whatever server array they've set up at this foundry, we're choosing between 2 flavors of bad." Nora had been standing near the door, her coat still on her phone in her hand with that cracked screen and those 9 terrible words still glowing on it. She set the phone face up on the nearest table without comment and pulled off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door, because standing there holding it was making her feel like a guest, and she was not a guest. "Then we go to the foundry," she said. Sable, who had arrived 15 minutes after them and was now standing with her tactical jacket replaced by a fresh one from what appeared to be a standard supply of them, looked at Nora with an expression that was not dismissive but was carefully evaluative. "You said you know the building." "The Ashby Steel Plant on the Calumet Corridor. East Bank just south of the 131st Street Bridge." Nora crossed to this table where Felix had pulled up a satellite image. She leaned over and oriented herself. "My father ran environmental remediation audits on the site from 94 to 98. I went with him twice. I was 12-13. The site manager let us explore the lower infrastructure because my dad needed the drainage schematics to do his work, and there was no one else to watch me." She traced a path on the satellite image with her finger. "There's a drainage network under the East Wing. It was built during the original construction in 1952, pre-OSHA soit pre-safety regulation of any consequence. Access points along the Calumet Canal bank, 3 of them spaced about 60 feet apart. They connect to the plant's basement loading infrastructure." Felix was already overlaying schematics on the satellite image. "These access points are they on any city infrastructure database. The drainage network is. The connection to the plant's basement isn't. It was built as an informal bypass during a 1961 expansion that didn't go through the permit process. It's in my father's audit notes from 1996. She paused. "I have copies." A brief silence in the room. Elliot looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "You have your father's audit notes from a decommissioned steel plant from 1996. I have everything from his case files. Her voice was even. Every document he ever created for every contract he worked. I've had them scanned and backed up across 3 separate drives for 8 years. She met his eyes. Because Victor Ashby destroyed my father with planted financial records. And I've been collecting anything that might eventually prove it. The silence stretched. Felix's eyes moved between them. Sable's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Elliot said nothing for a moment. Then, Ashby. He was the primary beneficiary of my father's collapse. Calloway Financial managed a portfolio that competed directly with 2 of Ashby's subsidiary investment vehicles. When my father's company went down on fraud charges, those clients migrated to Ashby, about $300 million in managed assets in the first 6 months alone. She kept her voice clinical. She'd had years to practice. The prosecution's evidence was airtight. The defense couldn't explain it, because someone had been very careful about making sure it looked airtight. She paused. My father has been in Sheridan for 8 years. He's 61 years old. He has type 2 diabetes, and 2 years ago he had a minor cardiac event that the prison medical unit described as minor. Elliot held her gaze. His expression had not changed, but behind his eyes something moved recognition, she thought. The specific recognition of someone who understood what it cost to carry that kind of weight for that long. You heard his name tonight, Elliot said slowly, in that corridor, and you still came to warn me. I came to warn you because someone was going to die. She paused. And then I heard his name and I realized I'd been waiting 8 years for a door to open, and this was it. Another pause. So yes, I want to stop this because it's right, and I want to stop it because it might be the only way I ever get my father out. Elliot was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Your sister, the text. Nora's chest tightened. Petra. She's 26. She lives in Evanston, works in healthcare administration. She made herself breathe normally. They've been watching me long enough to know about her, which means they've been watching me. Which means they know you overheard the conversation. Sable's voice was factual, not unkind. Yes. Nora looked at the cracked phone screen. Which means they know what I told Elliot, which means the timeline is compressed. She looked at Felix. Can you trace the text? Already running it. The number is a burner provisioned through a prepaid MVNO. I can try to triangulate the registration point, but it'll take 20 minutes and might give us nothing more useful than a convenience store in the south suburbs. Felix's fingers moved. What I can tell you is that the text was sent from inside the city. The tower data puts it within a 5-mile radius of downtown. They're not in Evanston, Elliot said. He looked at Nora. If they were holding her there, they wouldn't be texting from downtown. They took her and brought her here. The logic of it landed in her chest like a physical weight. Or they took her from somewhere between Evanston and here. She forced herself to think. Petra leaves work at 8 on Fridays. She takes the Purple Line to Davis and walks 3 blocks to her apartment. If they were watching me and made the connection, we find your sister by finding Ashby's people. Elliot's voice was direct. And we find Ashby's people by finding the foundry, which is where they're running the operation. He looked at her steadily. Your sister being in play makes this harder and also more urgent. I need you to know that I understand what that costs. It changes nothing, Nora said. I'm still going in. I know. There was something in his voice that wasn't quite admiration, quieter than that, more careful. The specific register of a person acknowledging something real. I know you are. Sable spread the satellite image across the main table and gathered the team herself. Felix, Elliot, Nora, and the driver, whose name Nora finally learned was Tova Park. Former Marine Current head of Elliot's tactical transport, and they built the plan in 45 minutes with the unsentimental efficiency of people who understood that time was a finite resource being spent. The plan was simple in outline and brutal in execution. Felix would remain at the safe house running communications and monitoring the authentication servers, remotely prepared to trigger an emergency lockdown of the pension accounts as a last resort if the transfer began before the team could physically stop it. Tova would drive and manage vehicle extraction. Sable and Elliot would handle security and confrontation. Nora would navigate through the drainage tunnels through the basement infrastructure to whatever they found inside. And Petra. Finding Petra. Ashby uses her as leverage as long as she's alive. Sable said not brutally, but with the directness of someone who dealt in operational realities. That means she's alive until he has what he wants. Once the transfer completes, she left the rest of the sentence alone. Then we stop the transfer before it completes, Elliot said. Yes, sir. Nora was given a tactical vest lightweight designed for movement rather than frontal combat, and a small radio clipped to her collar and an earpiece the size of a fingernail that Sable fitted with practiced hands. No weapon. Nora didn't ask for one. She understood her role with precision. She was the navigator, the key that opened the door. What happened after the door opened was not her expertise. But what happened to her father's records? What happened to the truth that had been buried under manufactured evidence for 8 years? That was hers. She put on the vest. She checked the earpiece. She went to the bathroom and stood at the sink and looked at herself for 30 seconds, pale, bruised-looking under the eyes, the small scar above her left eyebrow. A waitress in a tactical vest. The absurdity of it was so complete it had looped back around to something else. She thought, "You've been waiting for this." She thought, "Don't waste it." She walked back out. Elliot was by the door, changed into dark clothes. The suit gone. Without the tailoring, he looked different, broader, more physical, more like someone who had grown up in rooms that required a different kind of posture than boardrooms. He was checking a sidearm with the methodical focus of someone who'd learned to do it correctly and refused to do it any other way. He looked up when she came in. "Ready?" he asked. She thought about her father in a prison cell in Kankakee. She thought about Petra somewhere in this city being used as a bargaining chip in a war she hadn't known was being fought. She thought about 14,000 people whose retirement savings were being fed into a criminal machine by a man who had decided that their lives were acceptable losses. She thought about the note she had pressed into a stranger's hand with a borrowed pen on a cocktail napkin square. "Yes," she said. They drove south into the city, and Nora watched the lake appear and disappear between the buildings as they moved, a constant dark presence beyond the lights, patient and indifferent. At some point, she became aware that Elliot in the seat beside her was watching the water too. "My father worked at Ashby Steel for 20 years, he said without preamble. "Before it decommissioned. He was a press operator on the second floor of the East Wing." He paused. "He died of mesothelioma in 2014. Ashby's environmental compliance team had known about the asbestos exposure since 2001 and suppressed the reports." Nora turned to look at him. "Nobody went to prison for it," Elliot said. "There was a settlement, non-disclosure. My mother signed it because she had medical bills and 2 kids in school and no other option." His profile in the window light was very still. "Victor Ashby called me personally when I started Mace Dynamics, offered to invest. I told him what I knew about the asbestos. I told him why I was declining." He paused. He laughed. He said, "That was a business decision." He said it like a man who had never once considered that business decisions happen to people. Nora was quiet. 3 years later, he started trying to dismantle my company." Elliot turned from the window. "I told myself it was competitive, that it was business. I kept telling myself that right up until tonight when I read your note and understood that it had never been business." He looked at her directly. "It's always been personal." "Yes," Nora said, "for both of us." "Yes." The city moved past the windows. The lake moved past. The car carried them south toward the Calumet corridor and the old steel plant and everything they were going toward, and in the quiet of the vehicle, 2 people who had arrived at the same darkness by different roads sat in the particular closeness of a shared understanding that doesn't require anything further to be said. The radio crackled, Sable's voice in the second vehicle ahead of them. 5 minutes out, Tovatek the River approach. Nora walked me through the entry point one more time. Nora leaned forward and began to speak. The Calumet River at midnight looked like a wound in the city. Nora had not been to the South Lakefront Industrial Corridor in years, not since the last time she'd driven out with a box of her father's case files, and sat in the parking lot of the old Bethlehem Steel site, trying to understand something she still didn't fully understand. And in those years, the neighborhood had neither improved nor collapsed, but had simply remained suspended in the particular limbo of industrial land that capitalism had finished with but not yet decided what to do with. Rusted chain-link fences, cracked access roads, the skeletal structures of decommissioned infrastructure against the sky, enormous and silent, like the bones of animals too large to bury. The Ashby steel plant was the largest of them. It occupied 7 acres along the river's east bank, hemmed by water on one side and a freight rail easement on the other. Its perimeter marked by a chain-link fence with a Barricade Development Group sign that had been there since 2011 and had not progressed beyond sign. The main building was a sprawling 3-story complex of brick and steel that had once processed 12,000 tons of sheet metal per year and now processed nothing but darkness and time. Or so it was supposed to. Through Tova's window as they pulled past Nora, saw it a thin line of light on the second floor of the east wing, hard-edged and artificial. Not moonlight. Not decay phosphorescence. Electric light white and purposeful, behind what she estimated were blacked-out windows inadequately sealed. "They're up there," she said. "Yes." Elliot was looking at the same thing. "Felix, are you seeing activity on the network?" Felix's voice in the earpiece slightly compressed by distance, but clear. "Authentication probing has intensified in the last 20 minutes. They're close. I'm estimating another 40 to 60 minutes before they breach the second encryption layer." "Is the pension fund transfer queued?" "There's a transfer protocol initialized but not yet executed. They're waiting for the authentication breach to complete before they push it." A pause. "Which is actually good news. The moment they execute, the money starts moving. As long as the authentication is still holding, we have time." 40 minutes, Sable said from the front vehicle, her voice in Nora's ear. "We move fast, we move clean. Nora, the access point. South end of the riverbank. There's a concrete spillway channel about 30 yards below the plant's property line. It looks like a drainage outfall, which is what it is. But the access grate at the back of the channel opens into the tunnel network." Nora kept her voice steady. "The grate will be locked. It was locked in '96, padlocked through a welded ring. I have no idea if the lock is the same, or if it's been replaced, or if it's even still there. Could be rusted through." "We have bolt cutters," Sable said. "And if the padlock's been replaced recently, that tells us something." It did. It told them Ashby's people had been down there, had used the tunnels. Tova pulled the vehicle off the access road into an area of deep shadow, behind a derelict equipment shed, the kind of improvised parking that looked unremarkable in a neighborhood where abandoned vehicles were not uncommon. The lead vehicle, Sable driving Elliot in the passenger seat, had pulled in 30 seconds earlier. They got out into the cold. The wind off the river was sharper down here, carrying the smell of industrial water and cold mud, and something metallic that Nora associated with her childhood memories of this place, the particular mineral bite of a river that had run alongside heavy manufacturing for 70 years. Sable distributed equipment with practiced brevity flashlights, 2-way earpieces for everyone, the bolt cutters, a small medical kit in a belt pouch. She looked at Nora. "Lead us to the spillway." Nora led. The path to the spillway channel ran along the riverbank outside the plant's perimeter fence. Technically. Public land. Technically. Just a person taking a late-night walk along an industrial waterway, though no reasonable person would do so. She moved with her flashlight off. Navigating by the ambient light of the city reflected off the river surface, her feet finding the path with the muscle memory of 12-year-old feet that had walked it in afternoon sunlight behind a father who explained drainage engineering like it was poetry. She found the spillway channel in 4 minutes. It was exactly where her memory had placed it, a concrete trench cut into the riverbank about 3 feet wide, designed to carry overflow runoff from the plant's old fire suppression system. At the back of the trench, half hidden by a growth of dead weeds and 2 decades of accumulated debris, was the iron grate. Sable knelt beside it and examined the padlock with her flashlight, keeping the beam low. The padlock was new, hardened steel, commercial grade, no more than 2 years old. Sable looked at Nora, who looked back, and neither of them said what they were both thinking. Sable positioned the bolt cutters. 2 attempts. The lock gave on the second with a sound that Nora's heart amplified to approximately the volume of a gunshot. Though in reality it was barely audible, beyond 3 feet. The grate swung inward. cold, damp darkness beyond. The smell of earth and old concrete and the particular stillness of underground spaces, the complete absence of wind, the way sound changed in a confined channel. Nora's flashlight found the tunnel approximately 4 feet high, 3 feet wide, concrete-lined floor covered in a thin layer of sediment and moisture, running straight north toward the plant's foundation. "I'll go first," Nora said. "No," Sable said. "I know the layout. You don't. If something is different from what I remember, I need to be the one who recognizes it." She paused. "I'm not being brave. I'm being efficient." Sable held her gaze for a moment, then stepped aside. Nora went first. The tunnel was exactly as she remembered it, and also completely different the way places from childhood always are smaller and larger simultaneously, the scale distorted by the intervening years. The floor was wetter than it had been in a dry October in 1996, the walls closer, the darkness more complete. She moved in a low crouch, flashlight aimed ahead, one hand on the wall for orientation. Behind her, Sable, then Elliot, then Tova. Single file silent except for the soft compression of footsteps on wet concrete, 120 yards. That was her estimate from her father's schematics, which she'd held in her mind for 8 years with the involuntary thoroughness of someone who rehearses things they may never use. 120 yards, and then the tunnel widened into the old drainage collection chamber, which connected via a steel service hatch to the basement loading dock of the east wing. She counted her steps. At approximately step 80, she felt the tunnel slope very slightly upward. She remembered this had asked her father about it, and he'd explained that the natural gradient of the riverbank required a compensating rise in the tunnel floor to maintain drainage flow. The slope meant they were approaching the plant's foundation. At step 100, she stopped. The tunnel ahead branched, left and right. This she did not remember. She turned to shine her light back at Sable, who raised her eyebrows. Nora considered. Her father's schematics had shown a single continuous tunnel, but that had been the original 1952 construction. The 1961 expansion, the unpermitted one, the informal bypass, could have added a branch. Left would take them toward the riverside of the building. Right would take them inland toward the foundation of the main plant. She went right. There was no logical reason that she could have articulated clearly. It was the kind of knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind. A memory of following her father in summer sunlight and turning right at some junction, because that was the way the engineering made sense. 20 more steps. The tunnel ended at a metal service hatch set horizontally into the ceiling above them. A short iron ladder mounted to the wall beside it. Nora tested the first rung. It held. She climbed. The hatch was unlatched. She pushed it open 1 inch and looked through the gap. The basement loading dock. Exactly as her father had described it, a large below-grade space with concrete pillars, a vehicle-grade ramp at the far end, now sealed with a modern rolling door and industrial shelving along the walls that had been cleared of its original contents. In its place, cables, power cables and network cables, and the organized infrastructure of a server installation routed up through the loading dock ceiling toward the floor above. Empty of people. Lit by LED strip lights that someone had zip-tied to the shelving frames. Utilitarian sufficient the lighting of people who were here to work rather than to be seen. She pushed the hatch the rest of the way open and climbed through. Sable came through behind her in a single fluid motion. Then Elliot. Then Tova, who lowered the hatch silently behind her. They stood in the loading dock and listened. Above them, through the building's concrete skeleton sounds. Not voices at this distance, more like the subliminal vibration of activity, multiple sources, the particular combination of human presence and machine operation that you feel in the sternum before you hear it. Sable held up 4 fingers, then revised to 3, then held her hand flat, uncertain. 3 to 4 people upstairs. Elliot moved to the cabling infrastructure on the shelves. He examined it for 30 seconds, then turned to look at Nora. His expression controlled but charged. "These are running from the server array upstairs," he said quietly. "This is the physical backbone of the operation." He looked at Felix in the earpiece. "Felix, the authentication breach, can we disrupt it at the hardware level if we identify the right cable routing?" "Depends on the architecture," Felix said. "If they're using a dedicated uplink, cutting the uplink cable could interrupt the authentication request before it completes." But it could also trigger a local authentication protocol that doesn't need the uplink. Some systems have that as a failsafe. Give me a 60-40 answer. 60% chance that cutting the network uplink at the physical layer stops the breach. 40% chance it doesn't, and also alerts them that someone's in the building. Elliot looked at Nora. We need to go upstairs, she said. Yes. They found the stairs at the north end of the loading dock, a metal staircase that connected the basement to the main plant floor and from there to the second floor office level. Sable went first now, her weapon drawn, her movement up the stairs, a model of deliberate silence. Elliot followed. Nora stayed close to his shoulder, Tova behind her. The plant floor was cavernous and dark and cold. The remnants of the manufacturing infrastructure, press beds, conveyor frames, hook systems remained where they'd been when the plant was decommissioned, too large and expensive to remove, simply left to rust. The space smelled of old oil and cold metal, and the specific damp of a building that had not been climate-controlled in 15 years. And at the far end of the floor, up a second set of stairs to the mezzanine level, more light, more sound. Closer now. A voicemail flat, talking rapidly in the shorthand of someone providing technical status updates. They moved across the plant floor in the shadow of the press equipment, their footsteps absorbed by the scale of the space. Nora's heart was so loud she was half convinced it was audible. She focused on her breathing, on her father's face, on Petra somewhere in this building. She had to believe it, had to hold it as fact rather than fear. At the base of the mezzanine stairs, Sable stopped them with a raised fist. She listened, held up two fingers. Two people in the room above. Then a third sound from a corridor to the right of the stairs, a different direction entirely. Footsteps. And then a voice, younger female with a frightened edge. I need water, please. I've been here. Another voicemail bored with casual cruelty. You'll get water when Mr. Ashby says. Nora's hand closed on Sable's arm. Petra. Sable's eyes found hers. A single nod. She pointed two fingers at Tova and then toward the sound, held up a flat palm at Nora, stay, then pointed herself and Elliot toward the mezzanine stairs. The plan divided. Nora looked at Tova, who jerked her head toward the corridor. They moved together quickly now, quieter than Nora would have believed she could move, fear converting to a hyper-focused velocity that she recognized dimly as what adrenaline was actually for. The corridor off the plant floor was narrow and low-ceilinged, lined with what had once been supervisor offices, their glass partitions long since shattered and gone. 3 doors, one at the end, light under the last one. Tova reached it first, pressed her ear briefly to the door, then held up one finger. One guard. She assessed the door frame. Standard hinges, worn, not reinforced. She held up 3 fingers and counted down. 3, 2, 1. She hit the door low, shoulder first, and it gave entirely, frame and all, with a sound like a minor catastrophe. The guard inside was on his feet, but off balance. He'd been standing, not sitting, which was unlucky for him, and Tova's forward momentum converted into a controlled tackle that put him against the wall and then the floor in approximately 2 seconds. There was a brief, violent struggle of the variety that is over before it has time to become a proper fight, and then it was over. Nora stepped through the doorway. Petra was in the corner, zip-tied at the wrists to a chair leg, eyes wide, a bruise along her left jaw that made Nora's vision go briefly white with rage. She was wearing her work clothes, charcoal blazer, black slacks, which told Nora they'd taken her from the Purple Line commute exactly as she'd feared. Her hair was loose and disordered, and there was a dried tear track on her cheek that she'd clearly been too exhausted to wipe away. She stared at Nora. Nora, her voice was wrecked. Nora, what, how? Don't talk. Nora was already kneeling, examining the zip tie. Tova handed her a small, serrated blade from her kit, and Nora cut through it in 2 sawing motions, careful at the wrists. Can you stand? Yes, I think. Petra stood shakily, grabbing Nora's arm. Her fingers were cold. There were 2 of them. The other one he went upstairs maybe 10 minutes ago. We know. Nora gripped her sister's face in both hands. Look at me. Are you hurt anywhere else? No, they didn't. They just kept me here. They said I was insurance. Her voice trembled. Insurance for what? I'll explain later. Can you walk? Yes? Good. Tova is going to take you back the way we came, through the basement, through a tunnel. You'll get out at the river. There's a vehicle. Felix will be on the radio. You stay with him." Nora held her sister's eyes. "Don't ask questions. Just go." Petra's grip on her arm tightened. "What are you doing?" "Finishing this." Her sister looked at her for a long moment. Really looked the way sisters look at each other when they are trying to determine whether they are being told a necessary lie or a terrifying truth. Then she nodded once with the particular resolved trust that comes from a lifetime of being told things by someone who has never once lied to protect themselves at another person's expense. "Be careful," Petra said. "I will be." She watched Tova lead her sister toward the corridor, and then she turned and walked back toward the mezzanine stairs. The server room was on the second floor of the East Wing, in what had originally been the plant's administrative offices, a suite of rooms that still bore the ghost of their prior function in the form of dead fluorescent fixtures, peel-scarred walls, and the ghost outlines of where furniture had stood for decades before removal. In the center of the main room, occupying perhaps a third of the available floor space, was the server array. It was more sophisticated than she'd expected from the outside. 8 full server racks, 2 UPS units, a dedicated cooling system, portable industrial grade, and a main terminal that looked like it had been purpose-built for this operation, its screens displaying the kind of cascading data that Felix would have known how to read in seconds, and that Nora could only interpret in fragments. She identified the progress indicator, a transfer protocol. Percentage marker in the upper right corner, 63%. The man at the terminal was thin, precise, moving with the specific focused energy of someone who had been trained to work quickly and cleanly. He had not heard them enter, or had not processed what he'd heard as a threat. He was talking into a headset, the one-sided commentary of a technical operator reporting upward. He stopped talking when he became aware of Elliot Mace standing 4 feet behind him. "Hands," Elliot said. The word was quiet and very definite. The operator's hands went flat on the desk. Sable had cleared the room, checked the 2 adjoining spaces, and materialized in the doorway to confirm it. Nora came in behind her, crossing to the terminal, her eyes on the screens. 63%, she said. "How do I stop it?" Elliot said to the operator. Not a question. I can't. I'm not." The man's voice was compressed with fear, but also with something that sounded like genuine helplessness. "The transfer is running on a timed protocol. It's not a manual execution. Even if I kill my session, the transfer continues independently." "Who controls the protocol?" "Ashby's system administrator. He built the architecture remotely. I'm here to monitor to catch errors." "Then you're not useful," Elliot said. And to the man's evident relief, what followed was simply Sable pulling him efficiently away from the terminal and securing his hands. Elliot slid into the chair. His fingers began moving across the keyboard with the specific confidence of someone who understood the systems he was looking at a foundational level. He was talking as he worked low and quick to Felix in his earpiece. "I'm in the management layer. The transfer is running as a scheduled task. Felix, I need you to walk me through the kill command." "On it," Felix's voice in Nora's earpiece. "First, you need root access. Do you have the admin credentials?" "No." "Then we brute force the admin session. I'm pushing you a keylogger output from the pre-authentication phase. We should have a partial credential from the operator's login sequence. You should see it on your screen in a moment." Elliot's eyes moved to a secondary window. "Got it. Partial match, 3 missing characters. Try cycling common suffixes." Felix named 6 variants in quick succession, and Elliot tried them without visible impatience until on the 4th one, the management layer expanded and the root menu became accessible. "In," Elliot said, 71%. The number had ticked upward while they worked. "Kill process, it should be listed in the active task manager. Look for a process called TRX-exec or similar." Nora watched Elliot scroll through the process list. The clock on the server displayed the time 12:43 a.m. They'd been in the building for 22 minutes. Behind her, she was aware of the room, the hum of the servers, the cold air, the operator seated against the wall, watching with the particular expression of a man who has concluded that his best outcome is to be invisible. "Found it, TRX-exec. Elliot's voice was steady. "Killing. He hit the command. The progress bar held at 73% for 3 seconds. Then the screen changed. A red overlay transfer aborted. Session terminated. Elliot exhaled. It was barely audible, a controlled release, the sound of a man who has been holding something tightly for a long time, allowing the grip to ease by one fraction. "Felix," Nora said, "the transfer was aborted. What's the status on the authentication servers?" Breach halted. Felix's voice carried an audible relief that he was trying and failing to entirely suppress. The authentication probing stopped the moment the TRX exec was killed. They were running it from this machine. The pension accounts are intact. A pause. All 14,000 accounts. No money moved. Nora stood in the server room and looked at the red overlay on the screen and allowed herself to feel briefly and fully the thing she'd been holding back since she'd pressed that note into Elliot's hand at a table in Alara. Then the door at the far end of the office suite opened, and 2 men with weapons walked in, and the feeling ended. Sable moved first. She was faster than Nora would have believed, covering the distance between where she'd been standing and the first armed man in a time so short it registered as a single event, rather than a sequence, her weapon coming up, her voice cutting through the room. "Down! Both of you, down now!" The first man hesitated. The second did not. The second fired. The shot went wide intentionally. Nora understood a second later as a signal rather than an attack, and from somewhere in the building it was answered. Not just one shot, but multiple. The specific, terrifying multiplication of gunfire in a large enclosed space coming from the floor below, from the stairs, from outside. "They were waiting," Sable said. No recrimination in it, just the factual assessment of someone recalibrating. "How many?" Elliot asked. "More than 2. She had the first gunman pinned and was managing him with one arm while scanning the doorway. "We need another exit." "There isn't one," Nora said. "Not from this room. The second-floor offices connect to one staircase and one emergency egress that opens onto the mezzanine." "Then that's where we go." Elliot was already pulling her toward the back of the room. He stopped at the terminal, pulled a small drive from his jacket pocket, plugged it into the server array's USB port, and initiated a rapid data pull. "Felix needs a copy of everything on these servers before this building is someone else's problem." "That's going to take time we don't have," Sable said. 30 seconds. His voice was absolute. "Give me 30 seconds. The gunfire downstairs was intensifying. Nora heard voices organized, directed the barked commands of people moving in coordinated sweeps. The operator against the wall had curled himself as small as possible, which she found she had no capacity to think about. 20 seconds. Elliot pulled the drive. "Go!" They went. The emergency egress door at the back of the office suite opened onto a fire escape landing bolted to the exterior of the building, exposed, visible, a 30-foot drop to the plant floor below, with an iron staircase descending in switchbacks that would require 20 seconds under normal circumstances and which felt now like 20 minutes. Sable went first, weapon up, sweeping the landing and the staircase below. She signaled clear. They followed Nora's hands on the iron railing, the cold of the metal burning through her palms. 12 feet down, a figure appeared at the base of the staircase. Sable saw him first. She identified him in the same moment as Nora, did not an Ashby operative, not a tactical threat. A man in his late 50s, out of place, wearing a plain windbreaker and carrying a phone rather than a weapon, his face turned up toward them with an expression of stunned recognition. Elliot stopped on the stairs. The man said, "Mr. Mace." His voice was completely familiar to Nora in the way of things she had not heard in years but had never stopped hearing. She knew it the way she knew her own name, the way she knew the exact pitch of her father's laugh, and the cadence of his lectures, and the quiet, steady sound of him reading beside her bed when she was small, and the world was something she hadn't yet been required to fight. She said his name. He looked up, past Elliot, to her. "Nora," Edward Calloway said, and his voice broke completely on the single syllable of it. She was down the remaining stairs before she had decided to move. His name was Bernard Crane. That was how Edward Calloway explained it, standing in the cold shadow of the staircase, speaking quickly with the particular precision of a man who had rehearsed this for a long time. Bernard Crane, former financial systems analyst for Ashby Group, current cooperating witness. in an informal federal investigation that had never been formally opened because the evidence he'd collected had never found its way to anyone with the authority to act on it. For 8 years, Bernard Crane had been building a case file. Not because he was a good man, necessarily, though perhaps he was in the way that complicated people sometimes are, but because he'd been the one who had built the false transaction trail that destroyed Edward Calloway's company, and because he had lived with that for 8 years, and because there was a specific type of weight that certain people can carry and certain people cannot, and Bernard Crane, it had turned out, was not built for it. He had contacted Edward Calloway 6 months ago through a prison legal aid organization. He had told him what he knew. He had told him what he had. And Edward Calloway, who had spent 8 years trusting the legal system that had put him there and getting nowhere, had made one call to his daughter, who had spent those same 8 years collecting everything she could find and understanding in the end that the evidence she needed was always going to be inside the walls she couldn't reach alone. "I followed the money," Crane said. His voice was shaking the cold, the compressed adrenaline, the 8 years of this finally becoming real. From the manufactured transactions that took down Calloway Financial all the way through 4 shell companies to Ashby Group, Victor Ashby personally authorized the transaction fabrication. I was present when he did. I built the structures he told me to build. He looked at Elliot. "Tonight, this operation, the server array, the pension fund transfer, it's the same architecture. He's been doing this for 20 years. I'm the one who built the tools." He swallowed. "I have documentation." "Where?" Elliot asked. "On those servers." Crane gestured upward toward the second floor, toward the server room. "Ashby keeps everything, insurance. He calls it his library. He's never destroyed anything because he believes the library protects him, because he can threaten to release it if anyone moves against him. But it also means everything is there, every transaction, every fabricated record, every instruction he ever gave." He paused. "Including everything he did to Edward Calloway." Elliot turned to Nora. She was standing with her hand on her father's arm, and she was not going to cry in public. She had established this policy 17 years ago, and she maintained it. "The drive," she said. Elliot produced it from his jacket pocket, held it up. "It's on here," Felix said in their earpieces. "Full server pull. I have everything." From inside the building, the sound of boots on stairs, moving fast, moving toward them. "We need to go," Sable said. "My father, he comes with us." Elliot's tone permitted no ambiguity. He was already moving his hand at Edward Calloway's elbow with a natural authority that expected and received compliance. "And Crane, both of them." They ran. The plant's south exterior wall had a loading gate, long sealed, secured with a chain that Sable cut in one application of bolt cutters that opened onto the freight rail easement. They came out into the cold and the dark, and the smell of the river and the enormous still November sky, and behind them, the Ashby steel plant loomed against the city lights, with the mute indifference of something that had outlasted its original purpose and was now finally going to outlast this one too. Tova was at the vehicles. Petra was there. She made a sound when she saw her father that Nora was going to need several years to process. The vehicles pulled out in 2 minutes. They drove north along the lake, and in the back seat, Nora sat between her father and Elliot Mace, and Elliot's hand found hers in the dark. Not romantically, she understood that, and it didn't matter because it was true regardless, but in the way that one person reaches for another when the worst thing they've been afraid of has just become the thing that might save them. She held on. But back at the safe house, the first hour was medical. The safe house had a dedicated first aid room that Nora suspected served double duty as a serious medical facility. In extremis, it had the smell and the equipment of a place that had seen genuine emergencies, and while Sable cleaned and dressed the guard's impact injury on Tova's shoulder, and Petra was treated for the bruising along her jaw, Nora sat at the kitchen table with her father, and they did something she had not done in 8 years. They talked. Not about the case, not about the evidence, not about Victor Ashby or the server drive or the legal proceedings that were now. She was beginning to understand finally and irreversibly in motion. They talked the way a daughter and a father talk when they have been separated by something terrible and have each in their private hours rehearsed what they would say to each other when the separation ended. Edward Calloway was older than she had allowed herself to fully register in prison visits, where she managed the sight of him with a protective emotional distance that she told herself was dignity, and which was actually simply survival. His hair had gone fully white in the last 2 years. There were new lines in his face that hadn't been there at the last visit 3 months ago. His hands, which had always been a machinist's hands, large, careful, precise, were thinner. But his eyes were exactly the same. "Crane contacted me in May," he said. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to put you in a position where you were carrying hope again." He paused. "You've carried enough of that for both of us." "You should have told me." Her voice was not angry. It was the specific quiet of someone who has moved past the argument they might have had. "Yes." He looked at his hands. "I thought I was protecting you." "You always think that." "I know." A half smile. "It's a character defect." She put her hand over his. He turned his palm up and held it. "It's over," she said. "I mean it this time. It's actually over." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear Felix on comms, the low voice of a professional running calculations. She could hear Elliot in the next room on the phone with his legal team, his voice precise and methodical, building the case that would convert tonight's illegal raid into the foundation of a legitimate prosecution. "Who is he?" her father asked. "The man who owns this house." "Elliot Mace." She paused. "He lost his father to Ashby too. Different way, same man." Her father absorbed this. "Is he good?" She thought about it honestly. About the way he'd stayed in the server room for 30 extra seconds to pull the drive. About the way he'd said he comes with us without hesitation. About the ghost of pain that had crossed his face when she'd told him what she'd heard from Claudia. Not the operational threat, but the personal one. The love-turned weapon. "I think so," she said. "I think he's trying to be." Her father nodded. He understood that distinction. He'd spent his life trying to be. Elliot appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at them both briefly, respectfully, and addressed Edward directly. "Mr. Calloway, I have my legal team on the line. They're prepared to file emergency motions tonight with the server data as the evidentiary foundation. We'll need your testimony as a cooperating witness." He paused. "And Crane's. He's agreed to cooperate fully." Her father stood. Not quickly, he moved with the deliberate care of a man who has learned not to waste energy, but he stood. "Tell me where to start," he said. "What?" The next 3 hours were a different kind of war. Quieter, more precise. The kind of war that is fought in documents and declarations rather than drainage tunnels and server rooms, but no less consequential for that. Felix built the evidentiary package while Elliot's legal team, 3 partners from a Chicago firm who had clearly been on call-ready status for something like this, though probably not something exactly like this, assembled the motion papers. The server data was encrypted, transmitted through secure channels, and authenticated with a chain of custody documentation that Sable constructed with the methodical care of someone who had learned, apparently from prior experience, exactly what defense attorneys would attack first. Bernard Crane gave his statement in 2 hours. It was the most complete account Nora had ever heard of what had been done to her father's company, the specific instructions, the manufactured transactions, the deliberate construction of a falsified financial record that had been designed to be unimpeachable and had been unimpeachable until Crane had decided 8 years late that he was finished living with it. Edward Calloway's statement took 30 minutes. He was precise and flat and did not editorialize, which was exactly the right way to do it. And Nora understood watching him that he had been saving this for a long time, the controlled economical language of a man who had decided that if his moment ever came, he was not going to waste it on emotion. At 4:17 in the morning, the emergency motions were filed. Federal court, conspiracy, financial fraud, securities manipulation, wrongful conviction, facilitation, witness intimidation, corporate espionage, attempted theft of pension assets, kidnapping. The motions named Victor Ashby as the primary defendant. They named Claudia Wren as a co-conspirator. The arrest warrants were issued by 5 a.m. By then, Nora was sitting on the safe house porch, wrapped in a jacket that Sable had pushed at her without comment, watching the November sky begin its slow negotiation with dawn. The lake was visible from here, just barely a dark suggestion beyond the tree line, and she found herself unable to look away from it. There was something about the constancy of it. The lake didn't care what had happened tonight. It had been here before Victor Ashby and would be here after him, absorbing the light and the cold and the history of the city on its shore with the same absolute indifference it had brought to every prior catastrophe. There was comfort in that, she thought, or if not comfort, then perspective. The door behind her opened. Elliot came out and stood beside her, looking at the same dark distance. "The warrants are active," he said. "Ashby's primary residence is in Streeterville. The federal team is mobilizing. Will he run?" "His type don't run." Elliot's voice was even. "They fight. They call their lawyers and they leverage their networks, and they make the process as painful and expensive as possible for everyone involved." He paused. "But the process is underway now. And it's legitimate. Everything we obtained tonight, Crane's testimony, my father Calloway's statement, the server data. It's all been handled in a way that the defense can't easily attack." Felix made sure of it. She glanced at him. "The 30-second data pull." "Yes." A ghost of something crossed his face. "I spent most of the drive back from the foundry trying to figure out exactly what laws I'd broken tonight. Felix keeps a list. He's thorough." She almost laughed. "Almost. And eat it. Several. But Crane's testimony transforms the legal landscape. If you're a cooperating witness who leads law enforcement to an ongoing criminal enterprise, the manner in which you obtained the initial evidence is—" He paused with the precise diction of someone quoting a lawyer, "subject to prosecutorial discretion." Meaning the U.S. Attorney's Office, who called my general counsel at 3:45 this morning, is inclined to characterize tonight's events as citizen assistance to a federal investigation rather than unauthorized entry and interference with property. Nora considered this. "That's convenient." "It's accurate." His voice was quiet. "We stopped the theft of $40 million from 14,000 pension accounts and provided evidence that will result in the prosecution of a man who has been committing serious crimes for at least 2 decades. The U.S. Attorney's Office is aware of this." He looked at her sidelong. "Convenience and accuracy can coexist." She turned to look at him directly. His profile in the pre-dawn light was tired, the specific fatigue of someone who has been running on adrenaline for hours and is now beginning to feel the weight of what has come down on the other side of it. There was something in his face that hadn't been there at the engagement dinner at Alara, or that had been there but buried beneath the performance of a man who was supposed to be celebrating. Something open. Something that was neither the CEO nor the son from Pilsen, but something in between that she suspected was the person he actually was when he had run out of reasons to be anything else. "Claudia," she said. "Has anyone found her?" He was quiet for a moment. "No, she was at the restaurant when the lights went out. She disappeared in the chaos." He paused. "She might have run. She might have been taken." A longer pause. "She might have been eliminated once her role was complete." The last option hung between them in the cold air. "I'm sorry," Nora said. "Not for what she did, but for what it costs you." He turned to look at her. His expression was difficult to read in this light complex, carefully managed and beneath the management genuinely raw. "You were right earlier. I keep thinking if I'd seen it, if I'd paid different attention, if I'd asked different questions." He shook his head. "But I think the truth is she was very good at it, and I wanted to believe in it, which is the oldest trap there is. It's not a character flaw to trust someone who worked to earn it. You said that to me in the car." His mouth curved, slightly differently. "I meant it both times." He held her gaze for a moment, then he looked back at the lake. "My company's going to be in chaos today, Sim," he said. "The media will have the story by morning. There will be board calls and statements and lawyers in every room." He paused. "I'm going to be very busy." "I know. But I meant what I said. About your father. I'm committing Mace Dynamics' full legal resources to his post-conviction appeal. The server data includes every document Ashby used to manufacture the fraud charges. With Crane's testimony and the documentary record, the original prosecution case collapses entirely." He turned to look at her again. "He won't be in Sheridan much longer." She believed him. It frightened her how completely she believed him, and she filed the fright away for examination at a later time when she had the luxury of examining things. "One more thing," Elliot said. Felix flagged something in the server pull. There's a secondary data set financial records that don't relate to your father's case or the pension fund transfer. They relate to Ashby's relationship with Claudia. He paused. She wasn't a willing co-conspirator. The records show Ashby had been blackmailing her for 3 years. Financial irregularities from her time as a hedge fund analyst. Irregularities he'd helped engineer, which means he created the leverage and then used it. His voice was level. She was trapped. Nora was quiet for a moment. Does that change what she did? She asked. No, he said, but it changes what it means. She thought about a woman in a champagne gown, her hands trembling on a table at an engagement dinner, her eyes finding every exit. A woman who had said yes to a ring while living with the knowledge of everything that yes required. The specific despair of someone who had already decided there was no other choice and was only managing the timing. We should tell the prosecutors, Nora said, about the blackmail, about what Ashby had over her. Already have, he paused. Cooperating witnesses tend to receive more lenient treatment than co-conspirators. She looked at him. You're going to help her, she said. It wasn't a question. He shrugged a gesture she was beginning to understand was his way of admitting to something he wasn't prepared to make a whole speech about. She's not the one I want to see in prison. He looked back at the horizon. Victor Ashby is. The sky was genuinely lightening now. Not sunrise, not yet, but the specific pre-dawn quality of light that changes the dark from black to the deep blue of something that is already in the process of becoming morning. Somewhere in the city, federal agents were moving on a penthouse in Streeterville. Somewhere a man who had been choosing who got to matter and who didn't for 20 years was about to discover that that particular privilege had a term limit. Nora breathed in the cold air, breathed out. What happens now? She asked. Elliot looked at her. Now, he said, we finish it. Victor Ashby was not at his Streeterville penthouse when the federal team arrived at 5:47 a.m. The building's concierge confirmed that he had left at approximately 11:20 p.m. the previous evening, 10 minutes before the lights went out. At Alara with 2 pieces of luggage and a man the concierge described as private security, the kind you don't try to make conversation with. The garage recorded his vehicle exiting at 11:23 p.m. The destination, as best as anyone could determine from surveillance coverage and toll record cross-reference, was not O'Hare or Midway, not north or west. South on the Dan Ryan, then the transition to I-90. Victor Ashby was heading for his estate in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, 45 miles north of the Illinois state line. Or at least that was the working theory when Elliot relayed the federal team's update at 6:15 a.m. Through the Safe Houses Communications Center, Felix pulling satellite imagery and Sable cross-referencing with property records. His estate in Lake Geneva has a private airstrip, Felix said, not looking up from his screens. Single engine registered under a Shell LLC. The same LLC architecture as the Calumet plant. FAA registry puts the aircraft as a Cessna Citation CJ4, range of approximately 2,000 miles. That gets him to Canada, Eastern Caribbean, multiple points of non-extradition arrangement. Sable's voice was flat. He's running. He's not running, Elliot said. He'd spent 20 minutes on calls with his general counsel and the U.S. Attorney's Office, and he had the specific expression of a man whose understanding of the situation has just been materially upgraded. He thinks he's repositioning. There's a difference. He turned to Nora. He doesn't know what we have. He doesn't know Crane talked. He doesn't know we pulled the servers. He knows the transfer failed, Nora said. He knows the operation at the foundry was disrupted. He doesn't know the extent of what we recovered. Elliot's voice was measured. He's operating on the assumption that he can abandon the Chicago operation, liquidate what he can, and rebuild from somewhere outside jurisdiction. He's done it before the SEC investigation in 2017 went nowhere because key witnesses suddenly found reasons to be unavailable. So he needs to be stopped before that plane leaves the ground, Sable said. Federal aviation authorities have been notified. There's a team moving from Milwaukee, but... Elliot paused. Lake Geneva is 42 minutes from here. The federal team from Milwaukee is 60 minutes out. Ashby has been in transit for roughly 7 hours. The math was not complicated. Nora watched him work through it. How close is the estate to the airstrip? She asked Felix. On the property. The strip is at the southern edge of the grounds, separate from the main house. Runway is approximately 1,800 feet. Felix pulled up aerial imagery. Small by charter standards, but adequate for the CJ-4. He says, is there any reason the plane can't be in the air already? Pre-flight for a CJ-4 takes between 30 and 45 minutes. If he left the city at 11:30, he'd have arrived by 1 a.m. If the pilot wasn't pre-positioned, Felix recalculated, the aircraft could have been ready to depart as early as 3 a.m. It was 6:22 a.m. now. Then why hasn't he left? Nora asked. The question settled in the room. Sable was the one who answered it because Sable had the kind of operational instinct that recognized patterns before the conscious mind had finished articulating them. Because he's waiting, she said. Not for the plane. For confirmation that the narrative is holding. She looked at Elliot. His operation at the foundry failed. The transfer was aborted, but his backup plan framing you is still in play as long as the media doesn't have the full story. She paused. He's watching the news feeds. He's waiting to see if the story that came out of the restaurant attack is the story he designed. Elliot Mace, unstable CEO, violent altercation with staff fled the scene. If that narrative is holding, he can afford to disappear at leisure. If it's not holding, he runs faster, Elliot finished, or he does something to reinforce it. Sable's eyes were very still. Something that adds credibility to the story. Another incident attributed to you. Another witness who comes forward with a corroborating account. She paused. Or he eliminates the witness who can contradict it. She looked at Nora. Nora understood a second before Sable said it. You. He needs you gone. Sable's voice was not gentle, but it was careful. You're the witness who overheard Claudia. You're the one who can directly contradict the narrative that this was a breakdown on Elliot's part. As long as you're alive and talking, the frame doesn't hold. The room was quiet except for the low hum of equipment and the very distant sound of morning beginning somewhere outside. Okay, Nora said. Okay. I understand the situation. She looked at Sable evenly. I've understood it since the foundry. I'm still here. She paused. What I want to know is whether we can get to that airstrip before the federal team. Elliot looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise exactly, more like a recalibration of an expectation he'd been holding on to despite evidence. If we leave now, he said slowly, we're ahead of the federal team by roughly 20 minutes. He paused. But we go as support. We go to hold the situation until proper authority arrives. We don't... I know. Nora's voice was steady. I'm not suggesting we handle it ourselves. I'm suggesting that if Victor Ashby gets into the air before the federal team can stop him tonight means nothing. My father spends another year in Sheridan waiting for an extradition process that may or may not produce results. 14,000 pension accounts remain vulnerable to a future attempt. She met his eyes. And you spend the next decade fighting a narrative he designed specifically to destroy you. Elliot was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Sable. Can we hold an airstrip for 20 minutes? Sable's expression was the specific expression of someone who has been asked a question to which the answer is obviously yes, but who is taking a moment to appreciate being asked. Yes, sir, she said. We can hold an airstrip. They drove south first, then west onto the interstate, then north into Wisconsin on 43. The world outside the windows transitioning from city to suburb to the particular flat openness of the Midwest in late November field stubble and bare trees, and a sky going from pre-dawn blue to a gray that suggested overcast morning. The lake appeared briefly on the right, Lake Geneva's finger of blue-gray water between banks of dead vegetation. Felix was in their earpieces, continuously tracking the federal team from Milwaukee and building a real-time picture of the Ashby estate from drone footage that Sable had requested and that arrived courtesy of a contact she referred to only by a first name and a former rank. Main house is 300 yards north of the airstrip, Felix said. I'm reading 2 vehicles outside, one SUV near the house, one sedan near the strip itself. Possible pilot in the sedan. Ashby is almost certainly in the main house. He paused. I'm counting 3 warm signatures in the strip building and 2 in the main house from thermal. No way to identify which is Ashby without visual confirmation. Victor Ashby is 6'1", silver hair, probably still in whatever he was wearing when he left the city, Elliot said. He has a specific way of standing, like someone who believes the room belongs to him. That's not very useful from drone altitude, Felix said. It will be when you're close enough. They turned onto the private road that served the estate at 6:54 a.m. The gate was closed, a heavy timber gate, the kind that suggested the gentleman rancher aesthetic of wealthy people who want their privacy to feel rustic rather than fortified. Sable looked at it for approximately half a second, and then Tova drove through it, which solved the gate problem at the cost of the vehicle's front grille. The road to the airstrip branched left off the main drive. They took the branch. The strip came into view through the trees, a cleared rectangle of grass and gravel, a small prefabricated structure at one end that served as a hangar and pilot's office, and on the strip itself, engines idling with the low whine of a jet, preparing to depart the CJ-4. Tova stopped the vehicle broadside across the strip's entrance road. Out, Sable said. They were out. Tova killed the engine. The vehicle sat across the road like a definitive statement. From the aircraft through the windscreen, Nora could see the pilot could see his face change from the focused pre-departure expression of a professional to something more complicated as he registered the vehicle and the people now standing in front of it. The pilot killed the taxi and keyed his radio. From the hangar building movement, the door opened. 2 men came out, the private security. The concierge had described the kind you didn't try to make conversation with, now carrying weapons that made the conversation even less appealing. They moved toward the blocked entrance road with the directional purpose of people who have been asked to solve a specific problem. Sable stepped forward. Federal arrest warrants are active for Victor Ashby. She said, her voice carrying the flat authority of a statement rather than a threat. A federal team is 11 minutes out. The airspace has been notified. The aircraft is not cleared to depart. She looked at them. This does not need to become anything other than what it is. The 2 men exchanged a look. The calculation happening behind it was not difficult to read. She's 1 person, we're 2, and the woman behind her appears to be a former waitress. The math looked favorable. What the calculation did not adequately account for was the fact that Tova Park had gotten out of the vehicle on the other side and positioned herself at a flanking angle that the security team's assessment of the situation had failed to include. Or the fact that Sable Cross had in a career that spanned approximately 15 years of environments considerably more hostile than a private airstrip in Wisconsin, never once encountered a situation that 2-to-1 arithmetic had been sufficient to resolve in the other side's favor. The confrontation lasted 32 seconds. Nora would count them later in the retelling. After 32 seconds, both security personnel were on the ground, and Sable was walking toward the aircraft with her weapon in her hand, her posture as unhurried as someone crossing a parking lot. The pilot opened the aircraft door. "Ma'am," he said. His voice strained with the very particular strain of a hired professional who has found himself in a situation that was not in the job description. "Engine off," Sable said. "Thank you." The engine cycled down. From the aircraft's interior, no movement for perhaps 10 seconds. Then the forward cabin door opened, and Victor Ashby stepped out onto the air stairs with the particular dignity of a man who has decided that if he cannot control the situation, he will at minimum control his deportment within it. He was exactly as Elliot had described him. 6'1". Silver hair still impeccable despite the night, a charcoal overcoat over what looked like the same suit he'd worn leaving the city. The posture of a man who believed the room belonged to him, or in this case the airstrip, or in this case the morning. He looked at the scene before him. The blocked road, Sable's weapon. Tova, managing the disarmed security personnel with an expression that cycled through several phases, assessment, calculation, and finally a settling into something that was neither surrender nor defiance, but the specific composure of a very experienced adversary who is deciding how to play the next move. Then he saw Elliot. Elliot had come around the side of the blocked vehicle and was standing in the thin morning light with his hands in his jacket pockets and his face set in the expression that Nora had come to understand was not anger, but its more dangerous predecessor, certainty. Ashby's composure held, but something beneath it moved. Elliot. His voice was easy, conversational. A man running into an acquaintance on the street rather than being intercepted at his private airstrip at 7 in the morning. I wondered if you'd find your way here. Victor? Elliot's voice was equally calm. I have. 11 minutes ago, someone I care about told me that watching you get on this plane would mean none of tonight meant anything. He paused. She was right. Ashby's eyes moved to Nora. She was standing 20 feet away, and when his gaze found her, she did not look away. She held it the way she had learned to hold things that frightened her directly without flinching, because flinching invited continuation. The waitress, Ashby said. His voice was not contemptuous. It was something more precise than contempt, dismissive, the specific register of a man who had spent a career deciding which people counted and which people were furniture, and for whom the category of furniture had just proven unexpectedly inconvenient. Her name is Nora Calloway, Elliot said. Her father is Edward Calloway, who you imprisoned 8 years ago with manufactured financial records. He paused. The records are on federal servers now, along with everything else in your library. For the first time, something cracked in Ashby's expression. Not much. A hairline fracture visible for a second before the professional composure reseated itself. But it was there. Nora saw it. She suspected Elliot saw it. She was certain Ashby knew they'd seen it, which made it worse for him. That information was private, Ashby said carefully. It was illegal, Elliot replied. Which is a meaningful distinction. Ashby was quiet for a moment. Calculating. The way he always calculated, Nora suspected not whether he could win this, but what form winning might take from where he currently stood. You have one federal case, he said finally. Even if everything you claim is on those servers, and I'd be interested to review the chain of custody before accepting that characterization. You have one case in one jurisdiction, with evidence obtained through an unauthorized incursion into a private facility. He smiled. My lawyers have eaten more substantial cases than this for breakfast. Bernard Crane gave a 12-hour recorded testimony last night. Elliot's voice was even. He was present when you personally authorized the fabrication of the transaction records that destroyed Calloway Financial. He built the architecture you specified. He has documentation in your own words of the instructions you gave. He paused. Your lawyers are welcome to that for breakfast. The silence that followed was different from the prior silences. It had a different texture, denser, less negotiable. Crane, Ashby said. The word was quiet. He's been in contact with for 6 months, yes. Elliot looked at him steadily. He was tired of it. People get tired of things, Victor. That's the problem with building an empire on other people's willingness to carry it. Eventually, some of them put it down. Nora looked at Victor Ashby and waited to feel something triumph, vindication, the specific relief of 8 years finally reaching an end. She felt instead a very specific tiredness. Not the tiredness of the night's exertion, though, that was present too, but the tiredness of years. The weight of what it had cost, and what it had cost her father, and all the fights she'd had alone in apartments with stacked case files while the city moved on without them. She felt that. And then she felt it begin very slowly to lift. Ashby looked at her again. This won't give you back what you lost, he said. His voice was not kind but precise. The observation of someone who had spent a career being accurate about human psychology. A conviction, an appeal, an exoneration, none of it returns the years. You know that. I know, she said. Then why? Because it matters anyway. She looked at him evenly. It matters that the truth is the truth, and that you can't keep spending other people's lives like currency. She paused. It matters that my father knows before he dies that what was taken from him was named for what it was. Another pause. And because in about 8 minutes, a federal team is going to arrive, and you are going to be charged with enough federal crimes to occupy the rest of your life. And every one of those charges is going to be accurate, and I am going to be there for every day of proceedings, and I am going to be there when they read the verdict. She met his eyes. That's why. Victor Ashby looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Elliot. Then he looked at the blocked road and the downed security personnel and the idled aircraft. He put his hands in his coat pockets and waited. The federal team arrived in 9 minutes. The arrest was not dramatic. Federal arrests rarely are. They are bureaucratic, methodical, full of paperwork and protocol, and the specific administrative language of the law processing a human being through its machinery. Two agents in standard issue jackets. Miranda Wright's read in the gray Wisconsin morning the words as familiar and strange as a liturgy in a language you studied years ago and can still parse. Handcuffs, a vehicle. Victor Ashby seated in the back of it, not looking at anyone. He looked in that moment smaller than he had seemed. Nora watched the vehicle pull away down the estate drive through the broken timber gate onto the public road. She watched until the taillights disappeared behind the tree line. Sable appeared beside her. "You okay?" "Ask me in a few days," Nora said. "Fair." Sable looked toward the hangar where Tova was providing a statement to one of the federal agents. "For what it's worth, what you did tonight. In the corridor at the restaurant. In the tunnel. At the airstrip." She paused. "I've worked with a lot of people who are paid to do those things and who still find reasons not to. You did all of it without being paid and without a reason not to, except the right one." She paused again. "That's unusual." Nora considered this. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation. Coming from me, the distinction is academic." "Thank you," Nora said. Sable nodded and walked away, which Nora suspected was the closest to continued conversation that the woman was inclined to offer. Elliot came to stand beside her. They stood in the morning cold watching the last of the federal activity, the evidence team beginning its sweep of the aircraft. The hangar, the grounds with the particular quality of two people who have been moving very fast for a long time and have suddenly run out of things that need to happen in the next 60 seconds. "What happens to Claudia?" Nora asked. "She hasn't been found." His voice was carefully neutral. "But the cooperating witness classification that the U.S. Attorney's Office assigned means that when she does turn up, and she will turn up, she'll be offered terms." He paused. "The blackmail evidence that was on the servers is being processed. It substantially changes the characterization of her involvement." "She still chose to do it." "She chose while being coerced. That's not the same as freely choosing." He paused. "I keep telling myself that." "Does it help?" He was quiet for a moment. "It makes it more complicated." "Which might be the same thing." He looked out over the airstrip at the gray sky, at the bare trees of the Wisconsin November. "I keep thinking about the first time I met her. We were at a fundraiser for the Chicago Teachers Foundation. She was the event coordinator. She spent 20 minutes explaining to me why under-resourced schools were the single most important equity problem in the city." He paused. "She believed it. I could tell she believed it." Another pause. "I keep wondering how much of her was real, how much was the performance, and whether that distinction even makes sense when you've been performing something long enough." Nora thought about her father, who had spent 8 years in a cell maintaining the particular dignity of someone who knew who they were regardless of what had been done to them. She thought about the performance it required to continue believing in the value of truth when everything around you was demonstrating its limitations. "People are both things," she said, "real and the performance, all the time. The question is which one they act from when it actually counts." He turned to look at her. "Which one did Claudia act from?" She thought about Claudia's hands trembling on the table at the engagement dinner. Thought about the woman who had been trapped for 3 years inside a plan she'd been blackmailed into going to sleep every night in the life she was destroying in real time, wearing the ring that was both true and a weapon. Thought about whether that specific variety of sustained self-torment counted for anything. "Both," she said finally. "I think both." He nodded slowly. "What happens now?" he asked. It was the same question she'd asked him on the safe house porch, the same absence in it, not of information but of readiness, the specific gap between the end of the thing you've been fighting toward and the beginning of whatever comes after. "That depends," Nora said, "on whether you still want to offer me a job." He turned to look at her. For a fraction of a second, his expression was open in a way that the CEO from Forbes was never open and that the boy from Pilsen probably was. "I do," he said. "Good." She looked back at the airstrip, the evidence teams, the gray sky above Wisconsin. "I have some conditions." "Of course you do." "Don't say it like that." "How should I say it?" She thought about it. Professionally, with appropriate respect for the extremely complicated night I've just had. The corner of his mouth curved. It was the first thing that had approached a real smile since the engagement party at Alara, approximately 8 hours and an entire world ago. Professionally, he said, with all due respect for the extremely complicated night, tell me your conditions. She told him. Oh. They drove back to Chicago in the gray morning, the flatlands of Wisconsin giving way to the Illinois state line, and then the first creeping sprawl of the metropolitan edge. And Nora watched the city approach with the specific feeling of returning to a place that has changed in your absence, even when you've been gone less than 12 hours. She thought about what her conditions were, now that she had articulated them out loud to Elliot and seen them received seriously. The conditions were not unreasonable. They were that she would complete her law degree before taking any permanent role, that the position would come with genuine authority and not be a title with a subordinate function, that Mace Dynamics' legal resources for her father's appeal would be unconditional and not contingent on her employment, and that the ethics and compliance program she would eventually build would have independent reporting authority, meaning she would report to the board, not to Elliot. He had agreed to all of them, without hesitation. She had expected negotiation on the last point, which was the one that cost him the most in terms of organizational control, and the absence of negotiation told her something that she filed away without yet deciding what to do with. In the back seat, Petra had fallen asleep against her shoulder. Her sister had always been a person who slept when the crisis passed, a talent Nora had never possessed. She envied it. She sat in the back seat with her sister's weight against her arm and her father's voice in her earpiece. He was in the lead vehicle with Sable talking to one of Elliot's legal partners about the specific procedural pathway for a wrongful conviction appeal when the original evidence was being simultaneously used in a federal prosecution, and she tried to let herself feel what she thought she should be feeling. She felt primarily tired, and something that was not quite peaceful but was in the general direction of it, the specific stillness that follows very long movement. "Hey," Elliot said. She looked at him. He was in the seat beside her looking at his phone, or had been. Now he was looking at her. "Eat something." He produced a granola bar from somewhere with the matter-of-fact practical generosity of someone who had thought about it and then done it without making a ceremony of it. "You've been running on nothing for 8 hours. She took it, ate it. It was terrible. She didn't mention this. "The news is out," he said, looking at his phone screen. "The restaurant attack, the warrant, Ashby's arrest." He turned the screen toward her. Several feeds, most with his photograph, most with variations of the same text. Chicago Tech, CEO, Elliot Mace, survives coordinated assassination plot. Former rival Victor Ashby arrested on federal charges, including conspiracy, financial fraud, and securities manipulation. "The other story, she asked. "The one Ashby had designed. The corporate breakdown narrative. Still out there, but losing ground fast." He looked at the screen with the dispassionate attention of someone managing a weather system rather than fighting it. "By the time the federal arraignment is public, the counter-narrative is fully established." He paused. "My communications team, 3 people I trust completely, have been working the story since 3 a.m., the full sequence. What happened at Alara, what was planned, what was stopped." He put the phone down. "It's going to be a mess for a while. There's no clean version of this. There rarely is." "No." He looked at her. "But it's the true version." He paused. "Which, as you told Victor Ashby this morning, matters anyway." She looked at him. "You heard that?" "I heard most of it." He paused. "You were very, I don't know what the word is. Not brave. Something past brave." "Exhausted," she offered. "That too." He almost smiled again. "I'm going to use that in my statement to the press." Miss Calloway's clarity in an extremely complicated situation demonstrated that exhaustion and principle are not mutually exclusive. "Please don't." "No," he agreed. "I won't." They drove for a while in the particular quiet of 2 people who have established a trust under conditions that stripped away the social scaffolding that trust normally requires to build, and who are now navigating the strange territory on the other side of that, the ordinary world where trust is supposed to develop slowly and the stakes are supposed to be survivable. "Tell me about your father," Elliot said. "Before." It was the kind of question that she would have deflected 24 hours ago. She would have classified it as too personal, too vulnerable, too much to offer someone she didn't know. She had spent 8 years protecting herself by offering nothing that could be used against her. She answered it. She told him about her father at the kitchen table in their apartment in Bridgeport, working through engineering problems with a handheld calculator because he believed that the physical act of calculating connected you to the numbers differently than software did. She told him about the way Edward Calloway had approached every problem in his professional life, methodically, honestly, with the conviction that the numbers didn't lie if you looked at them correctly, and that the ones who couldn't find the truth in them simply weren't looking hard enough. She told him about the trial, and the day the verdict came in, and the specific way her father had looked at her from the defendant's table, not with despair, but with the particular sorrow of someone who knew that his daughter was going to carry this, and that he couldn't prevent it, and that it was the thing he was sorriest for. She told him about 8 years of case files, 8 years of legal aid clinics and pro bono attorneys, and the specific grinding bureaucratic resistance of a system that had no mechanism for admitting its own errors outside of the very mechanisms that had produced the error in the first place. She told him about giving up and then not giving up. About the night 3 years ago when she had sat in her apartment at 2 a.m. with every document she possessed spread across the floor and understood clearly and completely that she could not do this alone. About enrolling in pre-law. About running out of money 6 months in. About Alara, which had been the highest paying waitressing position she could find that had flexible scheduling for a person who was also trying to audit extension courses. About tonight. Elliot listened without speaking. She was beginning to understand an unusual quality of listening, not passive, but genuinely active, the kind of attention that is registered by the person receiving it as a physical presence. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You came to Alara to make money for law school," he said. "Yes." "And you ended up here." She looked out the window. The Chicago skyline was visible now, the familiar geometry of it approaching on the southern horizon. "Yes." "That seems like more than coincidence." "I don't believe in coincidence," she said. "I believe in accumulated choices. Mine, yours, Ashby's, Claudia's. All of them converging at a particular place in time." She paused. "My father used to say that the future isn't something that happens to you. It's something you approach, and you get to choose at each step whether you're moving toward it or away from it." "He sounds like someone I'd like to know better." She looked at him, something in his face open again, unguarded in the way that was becoming. She thought his actual face, when he'd stopped performing the version designed for external consumption, was very sincere. "He'll want to meet you," she said. "He's going to have opinions about your security protocols. Fair warning." "I welcome the feedback." He paused. "He has 8 years of enforced perspective on what actually matters. That seems useful." She nodded, then quietly, "Thank you." "For what?" "For believing me. At the restaurant. You read that note and you believed me." "It was specific," he said. "The details were too exact to be fabricated. The mention of Ashby, particularly no one who was lying or confused, would have included that. But you didn't know who Ashby was to me." "No." He paused. "I believed you because—" He stopped. "Tried again. You pressed that note into my hand and then you looked at me for a fraction of a second. You didn't say anything. You didn't explain. You just looked." He paused. "There's a kind of look that you only see on people who are telling the truth about something that is costing them. I recognized it." A longer pause. "I've had reasons in my life to learn to recognize it." She thought about his father, about the asbestos reports, about the non-disclosure settlement his mother had signed. "Yes," she said. "I suppose you have." The city was fully visible now, the skyline sharpening as they approached on the interstate, and Nora felt the particular sensation of a long journey reaching its end, the physical reality of arrival, the body's recognition that the movement is about to stop. She looked at Chicago with the eyes of someone who had left it frightened and exhausted and was returning to it with the specific knowledge that it was different now that she was different, now that some things that had needed to be undone were in the process of being undone. Her phone buzzed. Felix in the group channel. Claudia Wren turned herself in to the U.S. Attorney's Office at 6:45 a.m., requesting cooperating witness status. Her attorney says she has documents. Nora showed the screen to Elliot. He read it, nodded once. Good, he said. Just that. Good. She thought about everything that word contained for him and decided not to ask. Petra stirred against her shoulder, mumbled something that sounded like a question about breakfast, and went back to sleep. Nora put her head back against the seat. The city came to meet them. The days that followed were a blur of a specific kind. Not the terrifying adrenaline-threaded blur of the night itself, but the administrative procedural blur that comes after the blur of lawyers and depositions and hearings and filings and the bureaucratic machinery of justice working through its process at the pace of the deeply complicated. Nora gave her formal statement to federal prosecutors on the morning of the second day. She sat in a conference room in the Dirksen Federal Building and walked 3 assistants from the U.S. Attorney's Office through the sequence of events from the moment she'd poured champagne at Alara to the moment the federal team arrived at the airstrip, and she did it without embellishment and without editorializing and with the particular attention to accuracy that she'd been practicing. She now understood for 8 years in case files and legal research and the study of what it meant to present truth in a way that could not be dismantled. They asked her the same questions multiple times from different angles. She gave the same answers because the answers were true and didn't require variation. On the afternoon of the third day, Elliot's legal team filed the petition for the emergency review of Edward Calloway's conviction. The petition ran to 73 pages and was accompanied by 400 pages of supporting documentation, including Crane's testimony, the server data, and 3 independent forensic financial analyses that had been commissioned overnight and delivered at a speed that was, as one of the attorneys privately told Nora, not typical but not entirely unusual when the client has the resources to make unusual things typical. Her father read the petition in a conference room at the Sheridan facility, sitting across a table from Nora and 2 of Elliot's attorneys, and he read it with the same methodical care he had brought to engineering problems. And when he finished, he set the last page down and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The transaction records in Exhibit C, those are the ones they used at trial." "Yes," one of the attorneys said. "And these counter records from the Ashby server pull, they establish the origination date for the fabricated transactions as 6 weeks before the alleged fraud period." "Yes." "Meaning the prosecution's entire evidentiary timeline is inverted." "Yes." He looked at his hands, then at Nora. How long, he asked, not impatiently. He had waited 8 years. He understood how to wait. He was asking because he needed to plan, because that was how he dealt with uncertainty, by understanding its parameters. The emergency review petition requests immediate provisional release pending the appeal. The judge assigned to the matter has a reputation for, the attorney paused diplomatically, for moving at a pace commensurate with the weight of the evidence. He looked at Edward Calloway. "The weight of this evidence is substantial." Her father nodded. He reached across the table and took Nora's hand the way he had when she was small and frightened, and he wanted to demonstrate without making it a speech that he was there. She held on. Outside the conference room window, the November sky was the color of everything that was almost over. The provisional release order came on the 12th day. Not fast by the standards of the federal judiciary, which moved at the pace of an institution that had been handling the weight of human consequence for centuries, and had long since decided that speed was the enemy of accuracy. Fast by every other measure. Fast enough that Nora, who had stopped allowing herself to believe in timelines in year 2 of her father's incarceration and had not restarted, spent the night before the hearing, unable to sleep, sitting at the desk in the Tribeca apartment where Elliot had installed her, and staring at her father's original trial transcripts without reading them. The hearing was at 9 in the morning in the courtroom of Judge Patricia Wren, whose reputation for rigor was well documented and whose tolerance for insufficiently prepared counsel was by all accounts non-existent. Elliot's legal team had prepared for 7 days with the specific intensity of people who understood that this was the case that would define their billing year and also not incidentally determine whether a 61-year-old man with a compromised heart got to sleep in his own bed before he died. Nora sat in the gallery beside Petra and watched. She had learned over years of attending hearings how to read a courtroom the way her father had taught her to read a circuit diagram, not just the visible components, but the connections between them, the directionality of the current, the places where resistance was building. She could read Judge Wren's face during the defense's cross-examination of Bernard Crane and know without certainty but with reasonable confidence that the judge was not moved by the defense's argument that Crane's cooperation agreement compromised his credibility. She could read the prosecution Elliott's civil attorneys who had coordinated with the U.S. Attorney's Office in a procedural arrangement that the defense had challenged and failed to block, and know that they had anticipated every line of attack. She could read the defense who were doing their job competently and would continue to do their job competently and would lose. When Judge Wren spoke at 11:47 a.m., the room was very quiet. The court finds that the evidence presented in support of the emergency review petition establishes a substantial and credible basis for concluding that the original prosecution relied on fraudulent documentary evidence. The court further finds that this evidence was material to the conviction, and that absent this evidence, a reasonable jury could not have returned a guilty verdict on the counts of securities fraud and embezzlement. She paused. The court grants the petition for provisional release pending the full appeal. Mr. Calloway is to be released from custody forthwith. Forthwith was in judicial language a word that meant today. Nora did not cry in public. She had established this policy 17 years ago. She sat in the gallery with her hands folded in her lap, and her breathing carefully controlled, and Petra's hand tight in hers, and she maintained this policy for the approximately 90 seconds it took for the courtroom's procedural activity to be superseded by the particular quiet that followed, major rulings, and then her father looked at her from the defense table, the same look he had given her at the original sentencing, but inverted mirror image the recognition of someone who has moved from one shore to another and can now see clearly how far the crossing was. She maintained the policy until the exact moment that she stood and walked to the railing and he came to meet her. Then she abandoned it entirely. The media wanted a statement. Elliott's communications team fielded it as they had been fielding the increasingly complex media situation for 12 days with the efficiency of people who were very good at transforming messy reality into clear narrative. The statement Nora gave was 8 sentences. She wrote it herself in the apartment in 20 minutes, and she did not ask for anyone's input. She said her father was innocent and always had been. She said the system that convicted him had been deliberately manipulated by a man who had also spent the previous night trying to steal the retirement savings of 14,000 working people. She said she was grateful to the legal professionals who had worked to accelerate the review process. She said she was grateful to Elliott Mace specifically for the resources he had committed without conditions. She said she intended to become a lawyer, and when she did, she intended to spend a meaningful portion of her career making it harder for people like Victor Ashby to do what Victor Ashby had done. She said, if you are in a situation like my father's, if you are incarcerated for something you did not do, or if someone you love is do not stop, she said, I know how hard it is. Keep going. The statement ran on 3 major networks and was shared approximately 300,000 times across social media platforms, according to Felix, who tracked these things because it was the kind of problem that yielded to tracking. Nora did not look at the numbers. She had made peace a long time ago with the idea that she was doing things for reasons that had nothing to do with whether anyone was watching. Her father was released at 2:18 p.m. She was in the parking lot of the Sheridan facility with Petra and Elliott's driver, and she watched her father come through the processing gate in his own clothes that Petra had brought the day before, because Nora had thought of everything except this. And he stood in the November sunlight, blinking at the sky with the expression of someone doing a thing they had rehearsed so many times in imagination that the reality was both familiar and entirely strange. He stood there for a long moment. Then he looked at Nora and said, "It's cold." "Yes," she said. "I don't have a coat." "I brought one." She held it out. He put it on. He stood there in the parking lot of a minimum security facility in Kankakee County, Illinois, wearing his daughter's jacket because she had thought to bring it, and he looked at the sky again, and then he looked at her and said, "Thank you." "Dad?" "No." His voice was firm. "I need to say it. Thank you. You did this. 8 years and you didn't stop. I told you to stop. Do you remember? In year 4, I told you to stop. I remember. I was wrong. She stood with her hands in her pockets in the cold November parking lot and looked at her father, who was free, who was standing in sunlight, who would need doctors and follow-up appointments and a place to live, and the slow, uncertain process of reconstructing a life from the rubble of what had been taken. Who would need all of this, and who was standing here right now in a borrowed jacket, looking at the sky with the face of someone who has returned from a very long way away? "Let's go home," she said. She had kept his apartment, 3 rooms on the 4th floor of a building in Bridgeport that had been paid for by a combination of her earnings, and a legal aid fund, and an informal contribution from Petra that none of them had spoken about directly, because it was the kind of thing their family handled by doing it rather than discussing it. She had gone back once a month to turn on the lights. She had renewed the renter's insurance every year. She drove him there herself. On the 17th day after the events at Alara, Nora sat across a conference table from Elliot Mace and 3 members of his executive team, and they discussed the terms of her consulting engagement. The conversation was professional, direct, the kind of conversation that is conducted between people who have established trust in an unusual context and are now navigating the ordinary world that exists on the other side of it, with its ordinary conventions and its ordinary expectations. She had a legal pad. She took notes. She asked questions that she had prepared. She requested revisions to 2 clauses in the proposed agreement, and they were accepted. She signed at the bottom of the last page. "Welcome to Mace Dynamics," Elliot said. He was professional about it, appropriately warm, the specific warmth of someone who is trying very hard to maintain the distinction between a professional relationship and something that has already exceeded those parameters. Not because he wanted to reduce what they were to each other, but because he understood she suspected that the distinction mattered to her for reasons that had nothing to do with him personally. She appreciated it. "Thank you," she said. "I'll start by reviewing your current compliance documentation." She looked at the binder his assistant had placed in front of her. "This is thorough." Felix put it together. "It's good work." She paused. "There are 3 gaps in the third-party vendor review process, and your whistleblower policy has a structural flaw that would make it unusable in exactly the circumstances it's designed for." She looked at him across the table. "I'm going to be honest with you about what I find. That's what I hired you for." "Good." She looked back at the binder. "Also, your security screening for personnel with financial access is inadequate." She paused. "For obvious reasons." A very brief silence. "Claudia passed the screening," he said, quietly. "I know. That's not a criticism. It's a problem statement." She met his eyes. "Ashby compromised her before she came into your organization. The screening process you had couldn't have caught it." She paused. "The process I'm going to recommend would catch it." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. She nodded and returned to the binder. The meeting concluded 40 minutes later. Nora gathered her notes, said goodbye to the executive team, and was in the elevator before she let herself exhale fully. She stood in the elevator and thought about what she'd just done. The small thing of it, signed a contract, attended a meeting, made substantive professional recommendations, and the enormous thing of it, the thing beneath the small things, the fact of being here at all. The elevator opened onto the lobby. She walked through it and out onto Michigan Avenue, where November had turned the lake wind into something that required a real coat, and stood on the sidewalk with the city moving around her taxicabs and pedestrians, and the specific aggressive energy of Chicago on a weekday afternoon, and thought, here. She thought this is where it starts. Not the end, not the conclusion, the beginning of the thing that came after. She pulled out her phone, texted her father. "How are you?" The answer came in 30 seconds. "Good. Cold. Your building's radiator makes a noise like a small engine. Also, your neighbor has a very large cat." She smiled. Texted back, "The cat is named Gerald. He's fine." "How do you know his name? I've had his apartment." "I turn on your lights. Gerald and I have an understanding." A pause. "Then I have an appointment with the cardiologist on Thursday. Petra's coming." "I know. I'm coming too." "You don't have to. I know." A longer pause. Then, "Thank you, Nora." Again. She put the phone in her pocket, started walking north toward the train, toward the small apartment that was hers, and sufficient, and not the ending of anything but the beginning of the next part. The city moved around her. The lake was out there beyond the buildings, patient and dark and entirely indifferent. She had grown up with it as a constant, and she understood the way people understand things that have always been true, that its indifference was not the same as meaninglessness. Things happened. They happened to people who hadn't asked for them in rooms that cost more than they'd earn in 6 months in drainage tunnels under abandoned steel plants on airstrips in Wisconsin in the November cold. They happened, and they cost things that couldn't be recovered, and they changed things that couldn't be unchanged. And then not instead of those costs, not in compensation for them, but alongside them simultaneously, they opened doors. She walked. The city went on around her. The federal trial of Victor Ashby was scheduled to begin in March. Between the arraignment and the trial date, there was the specific procedural intensity of a major federal prosecution discovery fights, motion hearings, the ongoing investigation into Ashby Group's full range of criminal conduct that had, as these things tended to expanded considerably beyond the initial scope, once prosecutors had the server data and Crane's testimony and the cooperative participation of 17 former Ashby employees who had been waiting for precisely this moment to stop pretending. Claudia Wren cooperated fully. The documents she had brought to the U.S. Attorney's office on the morning after Ilara included 3 years of Ashby's communications with her, the original blackmail materials, the instructions, the escalating demands, the specific moment when Ashby had told her that her role in the engagement was to accelerate Elliot's timeline for certain financial decisions that would benefit the transfer operation. They included her own contemporaneous records of what she'd been told and what she'd refused and the boundary she'd drawn and the moment the boundary had been crossed. They included a voice memo recorded 3 weeks before the engagement party in which Ashby had told her in precise and unrepeatable terms what would happen to her if she failed to perform her role at Ilara. Claudia's cooperation agreement was finalized in early January. She was charged with 3 counts conspiracy obstruction and 1 count related to her role in the restaurant attack with sentencing recommendations that her attorney described with careful understatement as significantly below the guidelines range. She would serve time. Not the life sentence that Ashby was facing, but time. Enough to be real. She sent Elliot a letter in late January. He showed it to Nora only because Nora asked, and only because she'd asked in the specific way of someone who thought she might need to know its contents for reasons that went beyond curiosity. The letter was 2 pages. Claudia's handwriting was very precise. She said she was sorry. She said she knew that wasn't sufficient. She said she had been going to refuse at the last moment at the restaurant. She had been going to find a way to warn him herself. She said she hadn't, and she was going to spend the rest of her life understanding what that meant about her and what she was going to do with the understanding. She said the woman who warned him instead was braver than she was. She said she was glad Nora had been there. Nora read the letter, handed it back, said nothing for a moment. "Are you going to respond, Sherry?" she asked. "I don't know," Elliot said. "You should." She paused. "Not for her, for you. Because the answer you give or don't give is going to define how you think about this for a long time." He looked at her. "What answer would you give?" "That's not my question to answer." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you do that, but do what?" "Know exactly what something costs without flinching at the price." She considered this. "I think it's a skill you develop when the alternative is not knowing what things cost, and then being surprised when the bill arrives." She paused. "I've been surprised enough times." He looked at the letter. "I'll write to her, he said. "Good. Will it help?" "Probably not immediately." She stood to go. "But most things that actually help don't." She said goodnight. He said goodnight. She walked out of his office and down the elevator and into the city that was hers, had always been hers, even when she'd been invisible in it, even when she'd been serving it from behind a silver tray, and pulled her coat tighter against the January cold and went home. She was enrolled in 3 courses at DePaul's School of Law by February. The credits she'd completed at Columbia Law transferred with the kind of bureaucratic grace that happens when a university receives a call from an alumnus's foundation indicating a seven-figure gift is contingent on the expeditious processing of a specific transfer application. Nora had been told about the gift after the fact, which she appreciated. If she'd known ahead of time, she would have refused it, and Elliot had apparently correctly anticipated this. "You manipulated the admission process," she told him when Felix mentioned it in passing during a compliance meeting. "I made a donation to an academic institution," Elliot replied, not looking up from the document he was reviewing. "The timing was my decision. The amount was my decision. The connection you're drawing is an inference. An accurate one. A reasonable one," he allowed. "Whether it's accurate depends on your interpretation of institutional policy." He looked up. "Your interpretation is correct." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Also, don't do that again." "Noted." "I mean it." "I know you do." He went back to the document. "I won't." She believed him. The coursework was hard in the way that she had remembered, and also harder the combined weight of a part-time consultancy and 3 courses and the ongoing demands of the federal prosecution process, which required her testimony at 2 pretrial hearings in January and 1 in February, and the quiet, ongoing work of helping her father rebuild the infrastructure of an ordinary life. The thing you lost when someone took your years was not just the years themselves, but everything the years were supposed to produce: the small accumulations of stability, the network of people who knew you, the professional identity that told you who you were in relation to your work. Her father was rebuilding all of it, and she helped where she could. And she watched the particular courage it required to start from close to nothing at 61 with health problems and more than a decade of absence to account for. He found a position in late February. Not in finance, that door was closed, at least for now, the industry's long memory working against him despite the exoneration. In engineering. A small civil engineering consultancy needed someone with experience in environmental compliance assessment, and Edward Calloway had 30 years of it. The hours were reduced from what he'd worked before. The salary was a fraction. He took it with the equanimity of someone who had learned in the hardest possible way to distinguish between what a person needed and what they thought they deserved. He called her on his first day to tell her about the office. He described the layout with the attention to detail of someone who found comfort in the physical specifics of places. He described the other staff briefly and without judgment. He described the view from his desk, a parking structure mostly, but with a sliver of the river visible on the right side. "Is it okay?" she asked. "It's good," he said. And she believed him because her father did not say things were good when they were only adequate. "Nora, I want to ask you something." "Ask?" "Have you thought about what you're going to do with the degree long term?" She had thought about little else for 2 months. The question was not simple, and the answer was not simple, and she had been aware since she'd started the coursework that the answer she gave would determine something important about who she was going to be. "I want to specialize in wrongful conviction appeals," she said. "Eventually, after I spend some time at Mace Dynamics building the ethics practice." She paused. "The ethics practice is going to generate the kind of institutional knowledge about how financial and corporate crime is constructed that's directly relevant to the kind of case that to cases like yours." A silence. "That's not a coincidence," he said. "No," she said. "It's a plan." Another silence, the kind that contains things that don't need to be spoken because they are understood. "Your mother would have been very proud of you," he said. She let herself feel that fully for 3 seconds. Then, "I know," she said. "Go have a good first day, Dad." The federal trial of Victor Ashby began on a Monday in March, which happened to be the same week that Nora sat for her first law school exams, which happened to be the same week that Felix's monitoring systems flagged an attempt to access Mace Dynamics authentication servers from an IP address registered to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. The same shell corporation architecture Felix confirmed after 2 hours of forensic analysis that Ashby's team had used at the foundry. Someone was still trying. The attempt was identified, blocked, and reported to federal investigators within 45 minutes. The source was traced after another 3 days of work by a joint team from Felix's operation and the FBI's cyber division to a contractor who had been hired by two of Ashby's associates who were not yet in federal custody and apparently operated on the theory that attacking Mace Dynamics' infrastructure during the week of Ashby's trial was either boldly strategic or catastrophically stupid. The contractor was arrested. The associates were arrested. The charges were added to the expanding universe of Ashby Group criminal conduct that the prosecution team was managing with the particular energy of people who had been given the rare gift of a case that kept generating evidence faster than they could process it. "They're still trying to undermine you," Nora told Elliot, reviewing the incident report at their weekly meeting. "They'll keep trying," he said, "until they understand that trying makes it worse." He looked at the report. Ashby built an organization on the principle that if you keep attacking the same weak point long enough, eventually it breaks. The problem is that the weak points he identified aren't weak anymore. Because of the security upgrades, because of the compliance work. He looked at her. "The third-party vendor review you flagged in January. The whistleblower policy revision. The authentication protocols that Felix rebuilt after you identified the structural gaps." He paused. "The attempted breach last week failed at 3 separate checkpoints, any one of which would have been sufficient to stop it. 6 months ago, it would have succeeded at the first." She was quiet for a moment. She had been in this job for 2 months. She had spent those 2 months reading binders and writing memos and attending meetings and asking questions that made some people in the organization uncomfortable, not because the questions were aggressive, but because they were precise. Because they identified exactly the place where the system was being asked to work, and wasn't. She had understood the first week that what she was building was not a compliance program in the conventional sense. It was something more fundamental, a set of institutional structures that assumed bad faith on the part of the world outside the organization, and required the people inside it to be the kind of people who didn't need to be watched, because the alternative was unacceptable. She had understood this because she had spent 8 years watching her father be the victim of an institution that had failed to ask that question. "The work matters," she said, "not to him particularly, more to the room, to herself." "Yes," he said, "it does." They looked at each other across the conference table. "I'm going to the trial tomorrow," she said. "Opening statements." "I know." He paused. "I'll be there too." "I know," she said. She gathered her materials. She said goodbye. She walked to the elevator, and in the elevator she stood in the specific quiet that is available when no one else is present, and she thought about what tomorrow would be. She thought about sitting in the gallery of a federal courtroom and watching the prosecution open a case against the man who had taken 8 years of her father's life, and knowing that the case was built substantially, materially, built on evidence that she had helped obtain, on testimony that she had helped secure, on a sequence of events that had begun with her deciding not to look away. She thought this is what it was for. Not just for her father, not just for 14,000 pension accounts. For all of it, the specific accumulated weight of all the times a person in a corridor decides whether to act or to stay invisible, and what those decisions cost and what they are worth. She had decided. She was still deciding. The elevator opened. She walked through the lobby. Outside, Chicago was doing the thing it did in late winter. The cold still absolute, but with a quality of light that suggested it was not going to be absolute forever. A brightness in the afternoon sky that was not yet spring, but was beginning to consider it. She walked north. She had things to prepare for tomorrow. She had one more task before the trial. It was a task she had been deferring for 2 months, not because she didn't know what it required, but because knowing what something requires is not the same as being ready to do it. The task was a visit. Not to her father, not to Elliot's office, not to the federal courthouse or the law school library, or any of the places she had been spending her days in the reorganized life she was building. The task was a visit to the apartment building on North Paulina Street in Lincoln Square, where a woman named Louise Devereaux lived on the 3rd floor, and was, according to Felix's background research conducted on Nora's behalf, without Nora having to explain why she needed it, still working as a school librarian in Rogers Park, still teaching a Saturday morning knitting circle at a community center in Andersonville, and still living alone, which she had been doing for approximately the same number of years that Nora's father had been in prison. Louise Devereaux was the forewoman of the jury that had convicted Edward Calloway. Nora had not been planning to do anything with this information. She had asked for it because she needed to know, and she had received it, and she had sat with it for 8 years before the events of November changed the shape of what sat with meant. She stood outside the apartment building on a Tuesday evening in early March, 2 days before the trial, with the specific purpose and the specific fear of someone about to do something they cannot undo. The building was a 3-flat of the type common in that part of the city. Brick bay windows, a porch with 2 dead plants in containers that were waiting for spring. The 3rd floor was lit. She rang the bell. Louise Devereaux answered it herself. She was in her mid-60s with the direct eyes of a librarian and the slightly wary expression of a woman who had been answering her own door alone for a long time. She looked at Nora without recognition. "Ms. Devereaux," Nora said. "My name is Nora Calloway. I'm Edward Calloway's daughter." She paused. "I don't want anything from you. I just needed to tell you something." Louise Devereaux was quiet for a long moment. Something moved behind her eyes, not guilt exactly, but the specific weight of someone who has been carrying a knowledge for a long time. "Come in," she said. They sat at her kitchen table. Louise made tea with the automatic hospitality of someone who needed the activity while she decided what to say. When she sat down, her hands were very still on the mug. "I saw the news," Louise said. "In November. About Mr. Ashby. About what they found on the servers." She paused. "I've been waiting. I wasn't sure if you would—" "I wasn't sure either," Nora said. "Your father was innocent." "Yes. We believe the records." Louise's voice was precise and without deflection. The voice of a woman who had decided long ago that precision was the only honest response to the particular things she carried. Every juror believed the records. The forensic accountant's testimony was very thorough. The transaction documentation was extensive. She looked at Nora. "We asked questions. We deliberated for 4 days. We looked for reasonable doubt." She paused. "It was constructed to eliminate reasonable doubt." "I know," Nora said. "We found him guilty because the evidence said he was guilty." Louise held her gaze. "Not because we were careless or biased or insufficient. We did our job exactly as we were supposed to do it." She paused. "And a man who was innocent went to prison." "Yes. I think about that." Her voice was quiet. "I've thought about it for 8 years, about what that means that a system can work correctly and produce an incorrect outcome, that doing your job well is not the same as doing justice." She looked at her hands. "What do you do with that?" Nora had been thinking about this for 8 years too. She had an answer, though. She understood that it was her answer and not necessarily the right one. "I think you build better systems," she said, "not instead of doing your job, in addition to it. You ask the questions that the current system doesn't ask. You look for the gaps that a sophisticated fabrication can exploit." She paused. "And when a system fails, despite everyone doing their job when it fails, because someone built the failure in you, find those people and you make sure the next jury has evidence that doesn't lie." Louise looked at her for a long time. "Is that what you're doing?" she asked. "It's what I'm learning to do," Nora said. "I'm in law school. I'm building an ethics practice at a company that was nearly destroyed by the same man who destroyed my father." She paused. "In a few years, when I'm licensed, I'm going to specialize in wrongful conviction appeals." She paused again. "And the thing that I needed to tell you, the reason I came, is that none of that is your fault. The jury did its job. Victor Ashby broke the system that the jury was using in good faith." She held the older woman's gaze. "I needed you to know that I know that." The silence that followed was the particular silence of something set down that has been carried too long. Louise Devereaux put her hands over her face for a moment. Not theatrically, just privately. Then she lowered them. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for opening the door," Nora said. She finished her tea. She said goodbye. She walked back down the stairs and out into the March night where the city was doing its eternal thing, moving lit, indifferent, enormous hers, and she walked north for 2 blocks before she sat down on a bench by the river and looked at the water for a while. She was going to be very late to the library. The coursework wasn't going to complete itself. She sat there for 10 more minutes anyway. Then she got up and walked to the train and went home and opened her books and kept going. The trial's opening statements were on a Wednesday. Nora sat in the gallery and watched the prosecution lay out its case with the economical clarity of people who had the evidence to support everything they were going to say and understood that excess was the enemy of persuasion. The lead prosecutor was a woman in her late 40s named Diana Cho, who had been practicing federal law for 20 years and who had the specific quality of stillness in front of a jury that comes only from deep confidence in your material. She told the jury what the case was about. She told them what the evidence would show. She said the word guilty twice in her opening statement, once at the beginning and once at the end, and both times she said it the way you say the name of something that already exists and simply needs to be recognized. The defense opening was long. It was designed to be long. Ashby's lead attorney, a man named Reginald Fox, who had a reputation for managing to introduce sufficient complexity into federal proceedings that juries sometimes got lost in. It spent 2 hours introducing the concept of competitive intelligence and the historical context of aggressive business practice, and the specific argument that the government was attempting to criminalize the kind of behavior that had built every major enterprise in American corporate history. Nora listened to it carefully. She listened to it the way she had learned to listen to her father's trial transcripts, not for the argument's surface, but for the place where it was thin, where it was asking the jury to accept a premise that wasn't established, where it was performing confidence about something that required the jury to do a certain kind of work. The argument was thin at the center. The center was Victor Ashby, was aggressive and competitive and willing to use instruments that others found uncomfortable, but that was business, and business was not crime. The problem with the argument, and Fox knew this, had to know this because he was very good at his job, was that the evidence didn't support business. The evidence supported planning. The voice recording supported planning. Bernard Crane's testimony supported planning. And planning to steal from 14,000 pension accounts was not aggressive business practice. It was a federal crime. She wrote in her notes, Fox's theory requires the jury to decide that the voice memo proves nothing. But what does it prove nothing about? She underlined it. She thought, this is the question. This is where the defense has to work hardest, and this is where they are most exposed. She was right, as it turned out. The voice memo dominated the trial's second week in a way that Fox's pre-trial motions had tried and failed to prevent. The defense's theory on the memo was that it had been taken out of context, that acceptable losses referred to something other than human casualties. The problem with this theory was that it required the jury to accept a very specific alternate reading of language that was very specific in its original context, and the prosecution had anticipated this and walked the jury through the language in granular detail, and the alternate reading collapsed under the examination. Nora watched this happen from the gallery each day and took notes that she was going to use eventually in some form, not for this case, which was not hers to litigate, but for the understanding it was building in her of how a criminal case could be prosecuted well and what that required of the people doing it. She thought about the cases she was going to take when she was licensed, the post-conviction appeals, the people who were where her father had been fighting in the spaces of a system that had processed them incorrectly. She thought about what it was going to require to build those cases from the evidence that existed and the evidence that could be found, and she thought about whether she was going to be good enough at it. She thought, I will be. I'll make myself good enough. She thought that's the only version of confidence worth having. On the 17th day of the trial, before the closing arguments, Elliot asked her to walk with him. They walked along the Riverwalk. The Chicago Riverwalk in late March, which was cold, but no longer November cold. The kind of cold that reminds you spring is in negotiation, rather than simply absent, and he was quiet for a while, in the particular way that told her he was working up to saying something. She waited. I've been thinking about Claudia, he said. Okay. I've been thinking about the thing you said, that she was real, and the performance simultaneously, and that it depended on which one she acted from when it mattered. He paused. I think I acted from the wrong one sometimes. In the relationship. Not deceptively, I never lied to her or planned anything dishonest. But I was performing something. The version of myself that had everything managed, that had arrived somewhere and was celebrating having arrived. He paused. She was performing too, and I was performing, and we were both performing for each other, and that's... He stopped. That's most relationships, Nora said. Is it a lot of them? She looked at the river. The performance isn't the problem. The problem is when it becomes a substitute for the actual person rather than an expression of them. She paused. You perform differently now than you did at Ilara. He looked at her. Less managed, she said. More like you're actually there. He was quiet for a moment. I wonder sometimes if the night at Ilara was the most honest thing that's happened to me in years. He paused. Which is a strange thing to say about an evening that involved being shot at. You weren't shot at, she said. The shots were directed at the vehicle. The distinction is thinner than you're implying. The distinction is exactly as thin as it is. She smiled. What you mean is that you couldn't perform that night. There wasn't room for it. Yes. He paused. And you were very clearly not performing, from the moment I read the note. He looked at her. You've never been performing in anything I've seen from you, which is either recklessness, she said. I know, Sables mentioned it. I was going to say remarkable. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression that she had come to think of as the true one, open unguarded, the face that existed beneath the management, and which was, she had concluded, the most trustworthy face she had seen on another person in a long time. She said, I'm not remarkable. I'm just tired of the alternative. He nodded slowly. Tired of being invisible. Tired of pretending that invisible is safe. She paused. It isn't. My father was invisible. He was doing everything right, staying below the surface, not making problems. And Ashby still came for him because he was useful to come for. She paused. Visible is at least honest about the risk. They walked for a while in silence. The river was cold and gray and entirely indifferent. The same river that had run through the city for centuries, absorbing the history of it without comment. She found the indifference reassuring in the way she always found the lake reassuring. It reminded her that the things that mattered were smaller than the world, but no less real for being smaller. I want to say something, Elliot said, professionally and appropriately. You're using the formula I established. I find it useful. He paused. I want you to know that the position at Mace Dynamics, the permanent one after your degree, it's not a gift and it's not compensation. It's a recognition. He paused. Of what you can do. What you've already done. He paused again and she waited. And also that I personally, distinctly, from any professional consideration, would like you to be around. In the ongoing sense, not as an employee. He stopped walking. I'm saying that badly. She stopped walking too. She looked at him. No, she said. You're saying it fine. The river moved below them. March light fell on the water the way it did in cities where spring was still incoming, tentative, provisional, full of the knowledge of its own fragility. It was beautiful in the particular way of things that were still becoming. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay, he said. They stood by the river in the March cold, and neither of them said anything else, because neither of them needed to, and the river ran past them with its ancient and indifferent patience, and the city went on doing what it had always done. The trial of Victor Ashby lasted 19 days. Nora attended every one of them. She was not required to. Her testimony had been given in the pre-trial hearings and was not called again during the main proceedings. She had law school commitments and a growing consulting workload, and a father whose reconstruction of an ordinary life required ongoing quiet support. She had every reason to follow the proceedings via the news coverage that Felix summarized for her each evening, and none of them was sufficient. She sat in the gallery each morning at 9 in a seat near the center that gave her a clear view of the prosecution table, and beyond it, the defense. She wore the same 3 suits in rotation because she had 3 suits, and they were good ones. She took notes that she did not need, but that gave her hands something to do. Victor Ashby was represented by a team of 6 defense attorneys, the kind of team that in its aggregate billing rate represented a small GDP. They were very good at their jobs. They challenged every piece of evidence on chain of custody grounds. They filed motions to exclude the server data on Fifth and Fourth Amendment theories that were creative enough to occupy the court for 2 full days of argument. They cross-examined Bernard Crane for 4 hours, attacking his credibility with the systematic thoroughness of people who understood that a cooperating witness with his specific history was going to be their best target. Crane held. He had spent, Nora estimated, approximately 8 years living with the specific misery of a man who has done something wrong and cannot undo it and cannot stop thinking about it, and the weight of that time had refined his testimony to something very dense and very clean. He answered questions with the flat precision of someone who had rehearsed his account so many times that embellishment had become impossible. When the defense implied that his cooperation agreement had purchased his testimony, he said, "I agreed to testify because what I did was wrong. The cooperation agreement affects my sentencing. It doesn't change what I saw and what I did." He said it without heat. He said it the way he would have said it if he'd been alone in a room which was, Nora had come to understand, the only register she trusted. The forensic financial testimony occupied 3 full days and was to most observers in the gallery impenetrable. To Nora, it was not impenetrable. She had spent the previous 3 months developing exactly the vocabulary and conceptual framework required to follow it, partly through her coursework and partly through her work at Mace Dynamics, and partly through reading her father's original trial transcripts so many times she could nearly recite them. She followed the expert's testimony about fabricated origination dates and manufactured transaction chains with the specific satisfaction of someone who has been told a confusing story for 8 years and is finally hearing it told correctly. On the 7th day of testimony, the prosecution played Claudia Wren's voice memo. The memo had been authenticated chain of custody, established defense challenges exhausted. It played through the courtroom speaker system in the particular silence that follows a judge's instruction to the gallery that absolute quiet would be maintained. Nora had heard it once before in a prosecutor's office in January. She had thought at the time that she would be prepared for it. She was not. Ashby's voice was measured and clear and entirely recognizable. She had heard it at the airstrip in Wisconsin, and it was the same voice, the same unhurried precision of a man who had always believed the room belonged to him. He discussed the logistics of the pension fund transfer with the particular unaffected pragmatism of someone discussing a delivery schedule. He discussed what would happen to Claudia if she failed to perform her role in terms that were precise and unambiguous and not in any way she could identify, inflected with hesitation. When Claudia asked about casualties, he said, "Acceptable losses. We do what's necessary." The courtroom was very still. Nora looked at Victor Ashby in his chair at the defense table, watching him receive the public presentation of his own words, and what she saw in his face was not shame, not remorse. The expression of a man who had, in the private accounting of his own interior life, already categorized this as a problem of execution rather than a problem of principle. A man who believed in some foundational and unexaminable way that the question of who was an acceptable loss was one that men of his type were entitled to answer. She thought that's what she'd been fighting for 8 years and for one night in November and for all the days since. Not just one man's specific crimes, but that specific belief. The belief that some people counted and others were furniture. She thought the verdict, whatever it is, doesn't fix that. The thing she was building, the ethics practice, the law degree, the eventual career that she could already see the shape of, wouldn't fix it either. Not entirely, not permanently. But it made it harder. And harder was something. Harder was in fact everything. On the 14th day of testimony, something unexpected happened. The defense called as a witness a former executive of Mace Dynamics, a CFO, who had left the company 18 months earlier ostensibly on good terms, who testified that Elliot Mace had engaged in competitive intelligence practices that had, in the witness's characterization, crossed ethical lines. The testimony was thin. It consisted of 3 anecdotes, none of which on their own constituted wrongdoing, and it was clearly designed not to establish Elliot's culpability, but to introduce the narrative that this case was a conflict between 2 equally unethical operators, that Victor Ashby was simply the one who'd gotten caught first. It was a desperate play. Nora recognized it as a desperate play. The prosecution recognized it too and cross-examined the former executive with a precision that left his credibility considerably diminished by the time he stepped down. But she watched Elliot in the gallery he had been attending the trial when his schedule permitted seated 3 rows behind her, and she had chosen not to revise her own seating location to accommodate proximity, and she watched his face during the testimony. He was still. Not the stillness of someone suppressing anger, but something deeper. the stillness of someone deciding in real time what they were going to make of something. Not how they were going to respond publicly, but what it meant privately. She had seen that stillness before. She was beginning to recognize it as the expression on his face when something mattered to him. When the witness stepped down, Elliot caught her eye across 3 rows of gallery. She raised her eyebrows a question. He shook his head slightly, not the dismissal of something irrelevant, but the acknowledgement of something that had landed and was being processed. After the afternoon session in the corridor outside the courtroom, they stood beside a window overlooking the Dirksen Building's plaza, and he said, "Phillips was wrong, but he wasn't lying." "I know," she said. "There are things I've done competitive intelligence poaching talent from rivals, the way I handled the Kellerman negotiations, that I've told myself were standard practice." He paused. "Because everyone in the industry does them doesn't make them right." "No," she agreed. "I hired you because I wanted someone to tell me when I was wrong." He looked at her. "I want you to know that I meant it. I wasn't hiring a symbol. I was hiring someone I expected to make my professional life difficult in useful ways." "I know," she said again. "Good." He looked at the plaza. "Because the Phillips thing, I know what he was referring to. We used a market research firm in 2021 that obtained competitive analysis through methods I should have asked more questions about. I didn't ask because I didn't want to know." He paused. "I want to know now. I want it in your review cycle. I want the report on my desk with your actual assessment, not the one my lawyers would write." She looked at him. "Okay," she said. "That's all." "That's all." She paused. "You don't need a speech about it. You already know what it means. That's why you brought it up." She looked back at the plaza. "The report will be on your desk in 2 weeks." He was quiet for a moment. "You are extremely difficult to impress." "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's the most useful thing about you." She allowed herself a small smile. "Second most useful," she said. "The drainage tunnel expertise is still first." He laughed a real laugh, uncalculated, the same laugh she'd seen at the engagement dinner that had changed his whole face. It lasted a few seconds, and then it settled into something quieter. "Dinner," he said. "After the verdict. Wherever you want." She thought about it. "My father's apartment," she said. "He's been cooking. He says it's better than anything in a restaurant, which may or may not be true, but I think he needs someone to tell him it's true. I would very much like to have dinner at your father's apartment." "Good." She picked up her bag. "Then that's settled." The verdict came on the 19th day. Nora had been in the courthouse since 7 in the morning. Not in the gallery, the jury had been deliberating for 2 days, and their return had not been announced yet when she arrived, and she had spent the morning in a corridor on the 3rd floor, reading for her administrative law course, on a bench beside a wall of windows that let in the late March light. She had not been sleeping much. She had been eating adequately. She had on balance been doing better than she had any right to expect. The jury sent word to the bailiff at 11:14 a.m. She closed her textbook. The courtroom filled. Nora took her seat. Elliot was in his place 3 rows back. Her father was in this gallery. For the first time he had not attended the trial before this, because he and Nora had agreed without discussion that his presence in the proceedings before the verdict would cost too much, would require too much of the careful emotional management that he was still rebuilding the capacity for. And he sat beside Petra with the particular composure of someone who has spent a long time preparing to receive news and has learned in that time not to let preparation become anticipation. Victor Ashby was led in. He looked on the 19th day of his federal trial like himself. Still precise, still controlled, still wearing the suit that cost more than most people's monthly expenses. Still with the posture of a man who believed the room belonged to him. The jury filed in. The forewoman, a woman in her 50s with the serious face of someone who had understood the weight of what she'd been asked to do and had given it exactly what it required, stood. On the charge of conspiracy to commit financial fraud, she said, "We the jury find the defendant guilty." The courtroom was very still. On the charge of wire fraud in the 1st degree, guilty. On the charge of securities manipulation, guilty. on the charge of criminal conspiracy against the pension fund beneficiaries of the Mace Dynamics Deferred Compensation Program. Guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree, guilty. The verdicts continued. There were 31 counts. On 28 of them, the forewoman said the same word. On 3, the charges most dependent on the security footage that the defense had successfully argued was inadequately authenticated, the jury acquitted. 28 counts. Guilty. Nora sat in the gallery and held herself very still and listened to each one. She had been in courtrooms before. She had heard verdicts before at her father's trial, and at the lesser proceedings that had preceded and followed it, the motions and appeals and administrative hearings that were the bureaucratic texture of 8 years of legal effort. She understood that verdicts were not catharsis, they were determinations. Accurate or inaccurate, consequential or inconsequential, they were simply the system's output after processing a given set of inputs. But this one was accurate. This one was the true version. She let herself feel that. She let it land. Behind her, she heard Petra make a sound, not quite a sob, more like the release of something held for a very long time. She heard her father's silence, which had its own texture, its own density, the specific weight of 8 years reaching its accounting. She didn't turn around. Not yet. She was still looking at Victor Ashby, who was still looking at the jury forewoman with an expression that Nora spent a long time trying to read, and finally concluded contained less than she'd expected. Not devastation, not recognition. The expression of a man who had not been surprised, who had known at the airstrip in Wisconsin at 7 in the morning when he raised his hands in the November cold that this was the direction things were going, and who was already even now calculating the next move. She thought he will appeal. He will appeal, and his lawyers will be very thorough, and some of the 28 counts will survive appeal, and some may not. The system will do what systems do, grind forward with imperfect accuracy, not because anyone is bad at their job, but because the system is large and the truth is specific. She thought it doesn't matter. The record exists. The truth is on the record. The bailiff moved toward Ashby. The defense attorneys gathered their materials. The judge was speaking scheduling remarks, sentencing date, the procedural conclusion of the thing. Ashby turned before the bailiff reached him and looked at the gallery. He found Nora. She met his gaze. She thought he was going to say something. He had the posture of a man preparing to deliver a final line, the last move of an adversary who insists on having the last word. She waited. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away. The bailiff took his arm. He was led out of the courtroom and the door closed behind him, and that was the last time Nora Calloway saw Victor Ashby outside of a federal penitentiary. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. The judge gave him 32 years on the 28 counts consecutive where the statute permitted. With good behavior and his current age, his attorney suggested he might serve 22 to 25. He was 67. The mathematics were not complicated. Nora was not at the sentencing. She had an exam. She took the exam in a classroom at DePaul's law school on a Thursday morning in early May, and she wrote her answers in the clear, methodical style she had been developing for a decade. And she felt while she wrote that the future was a concrete thing, not certain, never certain, but concrete, touchable, something that her choices were moving toward in real time. She walked out into a May morning in Chicago that was improbably and entirely consistently with May in Chicago beautiful. The city had converted. Overnight it seemed from the gray and cold of the preceding 6 months to a specific luminous quality of spring green. Things beginning everywhere, the lake going from November, pewter to the blue, that was its actual color. The light changed the air, changed the city itself different in the way it always was when the season finally conceded. She stood on the steps of the law building and looked at it. She pulled out her phone, called her father. "How was the exam?" he asked. "Good, I think. Property law. The adverse possession question was thorough." "Did you get it right?" "I think so." She smiled. "I'll know in 2 weeks." A pause. "Nora, I've been thinking about something." "Tell me." "I want to do something." His voice had the specific quality of someone who has been working up to saying a thing for a while. Something that uses what happened. Not just, I don't want to only rebuild what I had before. I want to build something that was always supposed to exist and never did. He paused. A financial advisory service for people who have been financially damaged by wrongful conviction, the loss of income, the legal debt, the retirement assets that were liquidated while someone was inside. There's no institutional support for that. Nobody helps those people rebuild their financial situation. He paused. I think I could. She stood on the steps in the May sunlight. Yes, she said, you could. I'd need help with the legal structure. I know someone. I imagine you do. She laughed, a real one, full and unguarded, the kind she had been producing more frequently in the preceding months, as something inside her that had been held very tight for a very long time began carefully to loosen. I'll look into the nonprofit structure this weekend. We can talk through it next week. Dinner? Dinner, she agreed. I'll bring Petra. And Elliot. She paused. Her father said nothing because he was a man who understood the value of silence and the particular utility of not pressing a person who was in the process of deciding something. And Elliot, she said. She heard the smile in her father's voice without being told it was there. Good, he said. I have questions about his authentication security protocols. Dad, they're legitimate questions after what happened. They are legitimate questions, she agreed. He's actually made significant improvements. I'll be the judge of that. I know you will. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder. I have to go. I have a compliance meeting at 2. Go. A pause. Nora. Dad. You did something remarkable. She looked at the May sky, at the city, at the lake visible from here as a blue suggestion between the building's patient and constant and entirely itself. I did what anyone should do, she said. That's what makes it remarkable, he said, that most people don't. She said goodbye and put her phone in her pocket and walked down the steps and into the street and north toward the train, toward the office, toward the work that was hers and sufficient and ongoing and real. 1 year after the night at Alara, Nora Calloway passed the Illinois bar exam on her first attempt. She was 31 years old. She was working part-time as an ethics consultant at Mace Dynamics and part-time at a legal aid organization in Wicker Park that specialized in post-conviction work, which she had joined 4 months earlier because the waiting for the degree to be complete had started to seem unreasonable when the work needed doing. Her father was running his nonprofit financial advisory service, the Calloway Project. He had named it with the specific, understated directness that was his character, and it had in its first 6 months helped 16 families navigate the financial reconstruction that followed wrongful conviction exoneration. The day she received the bar results, she was at her desk in the Mace Dynamics office in the middle of a review of the company's revised third-party vendor screening protocol when the email appeared in her inbox. She read it once. She sat with it for a moment. Then she closed the laptop and put on her coat and walked out of the building into the November afternoon 1 year and a few days from the night this had begun. And November again, the lake going dark and cold again, the city doing the thing it did in November, the wind off the water, sharp and direct and entirely honest about what it was. She called her father. I passed, she said. A silence, the full, warm, encompassed silence of a man who has been waiting for a specific piece of news for a long time and has now received it. I know you did, he said. You can't know that. I've known it for 8 years. His voice was very quiet. I watched you fight for something true when the whole world was telling you there was nothing to fight for. A bar exam was never going to be the thing that stopped you. She stood on Michigan Avenue in the November cold and let herself feel everything she'd been managing carefully for a very long time. Not all of it at once. She was still herself. Still the woman who had established a policy about public crying and maintained it under conditions that tested it severely. But enough. The specific weight of it lifting. Thank you, she said, for everything you are. Nora, don't say it's nothing. I wasn't going to. He paused. I was going to say celebrate tonight. The work can wait 1 day. She smiled. Dinner, she said. Your apartment, 7 o'clock. I'll make the pasta. Don't make the pasta, Dad. My pasta is... I'll bring food, she said. From the place on Western. Just be there. She hung up. She looked at the lake, at the dark water, and the far shore invisible in the November haze, and the lights of the Navy Pier beginning to come on in the shortening afternoon. She thought about everything that had happened in the year between then and now. The tunnel, the server room, the airstrip, the courtroom, the verdict. The long, slow, ordinary work of building things that mattered. Her phone buzzed. A text from Elliot Sable told me. "Congratulations, counselor." She typed back, "Did you have her monitoring my bar results?" A pause. "Then I prefer anticipating." She laughed. Typed, 7 o'clock. My father's apartment. Don't be late. Wouldn't dream of it. She put the phone in her pocket. She stood for one more moment on the street in the city that had always been hers, with the lake at her back and the future ahead, and all the work that was going to be required to do the things she intended to do. The cases that needed building, the systems that needed changing, the people who were invisible, because the world had decided to look past them, and who needed someone to decide otherwise. She was 31 years old. She was a lawyer. She had things to do. She walked. But before she walked entirely away from it, she let herself stand for one moment with the full year. Not to dwell. She had never been someone who dwelt, but to inventory the way her father had always inventoried engineering problems before moving to solutions, knowing the complete state of a thing before you began changing it. The Calloway project had 16 families in its first cohort. Its operating model had been reviewed by 3 nonprofit attorneys and 2 financial planning specialists, and rated by the one organization that formally reviewed this kind of service as filling a critical gap in post-exoneration support infrastructure. Her father ran it out of a 2-room office in Bridgeport, 3 blocks from the apartment where Nora had grown up. He had hired 1 part-time staff member, a graduate student in social work, and was negotiating with 2 pro bono accounting firms for donated services. He was 62 years old and working harder than he had since before his arrest, and he was the happiest she had seen him in many years. The ethics and compliance practice at Mace Dynamics had in 11 months produced 12 formal recommendations, 9 of which had been fully implemented and 3 of which were in progress. The third-party vendor review process she had overhauled had identified 4 vendors with compliance issues that had been remediated before they became incidents. The whistleblower policy revision had been used twice, not for major wrongdoing, but for the kind of low-level ethical drift that unchecked became major wrongdoing. The anonymous reports had been investigated, addressed, and closed. The employees who had filed them had, as far as she could determine, faced no retaliation. That was the thing that mattered most to her. Not the visible architecture of the compliance program, but the invisible test of it, whether it worked in the specific situation where it was most likely to fail, whether the people who used it were protected. They had been. Felix had taken to sending her a weekly summary of attempted security incidents, which she read every Monday morning with the focused attention of someone who understood that the gap between an attempted breach and a successful one was maintained by continuous work rather than any single achievement. The summary had included, in the past 11 months, 43 attempted intrusions of varying sophistication. None had succeeded. He had also 3 months ago taken to including at the bottom of each summary a brief note that had nothing to do with security, a restaurant recommendation, a reference to an article she might find interesting, a 3-sentence commentary on whatever was currently competing for his attention intellectually. She had come to understand his way of acknowledging that they were colleagues in a sense that exceeded the formal and that the formal arrangement didn't quite cover. She had started replying. Sable had opened a private security consultancy in August, still under contract with Mace Dynamics, but operating independently, and had hired 3 people, including Tova Park. She and Nora had lunch once a month at a Ukrainian restaurant in Ukrainian Village that Sable chose because the food was excellent, and it had no pretensions, and they talked about things other than work more often than they talked about work, which Nora suspected was Sable's version of the warmest possible friendship. Petra had been promoted to director of her healthcare administration department and had started dating someone she described as boringly normal in the best possible way, which Nora considered among the most hopeful sentences she had heard all year. Claudia Wren was serving an 18-month sentence at a minimum security facility in downstate Illinois. She had, according to her attorney, been a model inmate, which Nora took to mean that she was doing the work that the specific variety of her error required. Elliot had written back to her 3rd letter. The exchange had become over time something that Nora suspected neither of them would ever describe publicly, but that was doing the slow, unglamorous work of becoming something real. Nora thought about this sometimes, about the cost of what Claudia had done, and the question of what she owed and whether those were separable things, and whether the answer changed depending on what she did next. She had not arrived at a conclusion that satisfied her, which she suspected was appropriate. Some things were not supposed to satisfy. Some things were supposed to remain present inconclusive, requiring continued attention. She was better at sitting with that than she had been a year ago. She was better at most things than she had been a year ago. That was, she thought, the best that could be said for any year. It made you better at things. Bernard Crane had entered his plea agreement in January and been sentenced to 18 months of house arrest and 200 hours of community service. He was teaching a financial literacy course at a community college on the west side, which was not a penance so much as a conversion of the specific expertise that had enabled the harm into something that could not by its nature enable the same harm again. She had met him once briefly at the courthouse. He had seemed diminished, not beaten, but quieter, like a room from which unnecessary furniture had been removed. She had no opinion about him that she was comfortable stating. She suspected she wouldn't for a long time. And Victor Ashby. Victor Ashby's defense team had filed 4 appeal motions between the verdict and sentencing, all of which had been denied. They had filed 2 more in the 6 months since sentencing, one of which was still pending before the appellate court. They would file more. The machine of his defense would operate for years because he had the resources to operate it, and because men like him, she had come to understand, did not stop fighting until they physically could not continue. But he was in custody. He was serving his sentence. And the truth of what he had done was on the public record in the language of federal courts, in the testimony of witnesses who had stood up and been precise in the voice recording that had played in a silent courtroom, and which had been reported and analyzed and was now a permanent part of the account of what a man in a position of power could choose to do with it. He could not take that back. She stood on the street and inventoried all of it, and then she put it away and started walking. The work was ongoing. She had a dinner to get to. She had, starting on Monday, the full weight and privilege and responsibility of practicing law. She walked, but so. She was 31 years old. She was working part-time as an ethics consultant at Mace Dynamics and part-time at a legal aid organization in Wicker Park that specialized in post-conviction work, which she had joined 4 months earlier because the waiting for the degree to be complete had started to seem unreasonable when the work needed doing. Her father was running his nonprofit financial advisory service, the Calloway Project, he had named it, with the specific understated directness that was his character, and it had, in its first 6 months, helped 16 families navigate the financial reconstruction that followed wrongful conviction exoneration. The day she received the bar results, she was at her desk in the Mace Dynamics office, in the middle of a review of the company's revised third-party vendor screening protocol, when the email appeared in her inbox. She read it once. She sat with it for a moment. Then she closed the laptop and put on her coat and walked out of the building into the November afternoon 1 year, and a few days from the night this had begun, and November again, the lake going dark and cold again, the city doing the thing it did in November, the wind off the water sharp and direct and entirely honest about what it was. She called her father. "I passed," she said. A silence, the full, warm, encompassed silence of a man who has been waiting for a specific piece of news for a long time and has now received it. "I know you did," he said. "You can't know that. I've known it for 8 years. His voice was very quiet. "I watched you fight for something true, when the whole world was telling you there was nothing to fight for. A bar exam was never going to be the thing that stopped you." She stood on Michigan Avenue in the November cold and let herself feel everything she'd been managing carefully for a very long time. Not all of it at once, she was still herself. Still the woman who had established a policy about public crying and maintained it under conditions that tested it severely. But enough, the specific weight of it lifting. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you are. Nora, don't say it's nothing. I wasn't going to." He paused. "I was going to say celebrate tonight. The work can wait 1 day." She smiled. "Dinner," she said. "Your apartment, 7 o'clock. I'll make the pasta." Don't make the pasta, Dad. My pasta is. I'll bring food, she said, from the place on Western. Just be there. She hung up. She looked at the lake, at the dark water and the far shore invisible in the November haze, and the lights of the Navy Pier beginning to come on in the shortening afternoon. She thought about everything that had happened in the year between then and now. The tunnel, the server room, the airstrip, the courtroom, the verdict. The long, slow, ordinary work of building things that mattered. Her phone buzzed. A text from Elliot Sable told me, "Congratulations, counselor." She typed back, "Did you have her monitoring my bar results?" A pause. "Then I prefer anticipating." She laughed. Typed, 7 o'clock. My father's apartment. Don't be late, wouldn't dream of it. She put the phone in her pocket. She stood for one more moment on the street in the city that had always been hers, with the lake at her back, and the future ahead, and all the work that was going to be required to do the things she intended to do, the cases that needed building, the systems that needed changing, the people who were invisible because the world had decided to look past them, and who needed someone to decide otherwise. She was 31 years old. She was a lawyer. She had things to do. She walked. Damn. Later at her father's apartment with pasta that Elliot had brought from the place on Western, despite her instructions, and that was, she had to admit, excellent. And with Petra at the table doing the thing she did that was equal parts chaotic and essential, and with her father talking to Elliot about authentication protocols in the specific engaged way of a man who has found someone willing to have the conversation seriously. Nora sat at the table of the apartment she had kept lit for 8 years, and looked at the people around it and let the moment be exactly what it was. Not perfect, not resolved in the way of things that are simply completed. Her father was still rebuilding. The Calloway project had 16 families but needed 100 more. Claudia Wren was serving her sentence and had written 3 more letters that Elliot had responded to, and which Nora suspected were doing the slow work of becoming something neither of them had anticipated. The legal aid work was hard and underfunded, and would be hard and underfunded for as long as she did it. The ethics practice at Mace Dynamics was ongoing and would always be ongoing, because the work of making sure an institution asked the right questions about itself was not a project with an end date. None of it was finished. All of it was hers. Her father said something that made Elliot laugh, the full laugh, the one that changed his face, and Petra threw a bread roll at the conversation for reasons that were obscure and entirely consistent with Petra. And the November city moved outside the window with its eternal, indifferent energy, and somewhere in a federal penitentiary, a man who had believed that some people counted and others didn't was beginning his 32nd year of accounting for that belief. Nora picked up her glass. "To beginnings," she said. Her father raised his glass. Elliot raised his. Petra raised hers belatedly with the bread roll still in her other hand. "To beginnings," her father said. He looked at her across the table with eyes that were the same as they had always been. Steady, clear, the eyes of a man who had always known who he was and had needed his daughter to prove the world could know it too. She held his gaze. The city glittered beyond the window. The lake moved in the dark. Somewhere on a restored server that Felix backed up daily across multiple redundant systems, the evidence that had changed everything sat in digital permanence, patient and indelible. It would be there when it was needed. It would be there for the next case and the case after that. Truth, Nora had learned, was not something that happened once and then ended. It was something that required maintenance. It required people who were willing to keep going back to it, keep insisting on it, keep making it real in the places where it was easier and safer to pretend it wasn't there. She was one of those people. She intended to keep being one. The evening went on. The pasta was in fact excellent. Her father was wrong about it, and she was not going to tell him. She was 31 years old. She was a lawyer. She was here at a table with the people who mattered in the city that had always been hers. The story didn't end. It never ended. It just kept becoming what it was supposed to be, one choice at a time. She was not afraid of that. She picked up her fork and let herself be here entirely and completely in the room where she had landed after everything, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.